Bartholomew Creed rode his horse directly into the market square and said nothing for a long moment. He let the silence do its work. Then he pointed one gloved finger at Lenora Vance, who stood chained to the punishment post with a painted board around her neck, and told the crowd she was available to whoever wanted the trouble of her. He said it the way a man announces the disposal of livestock. Flat board final. Someone laughed. Then more people laughed. Creed smiled at the sound of it, satisfied, and turned his horse around without once looking at Lenora's face. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time, because the story you're about to hear is only getting more dangerous from here. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from, and follow along to the very end. Stories like this one don't wait for anyone. The summer of 1887 arrived in Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, the way bad news always does, without warning and without apology. The heat had baked the main road to something like hardened clay, and the market square smelled of horse sweat sawdust and the particular sourness that comes from too many people crowded too close together in weather that has no mercy. It was the kind of morning that made people irritable before they'd finished their coffee, and the crowd that had gathered near the center post wasn't there for commerce. They were there for the spectacle. Lenora Vance had been chained to the punishment post since before sunrise. She stood with her wrists bound together above the iron ring, her feet flat on the platform, her back straight in a way that had cost her considerable effort over the past several hours. She was 28 years old. She had dark hair that had come partly loose from its pins during the night, and her dress, the same brown wool she'd been wearing when Creed's men took her, was creased and damp at the collar. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, and she had understood for most of her life that her body drew attention she hadn't invited and commentary she hadn't requested. A painted sign around her neck read, "Thief, liar. Take her if you want her." She kept her eyes on the middle distance. A man passing with a produce cart said something to his companion that made them both laugh and look back at her. She didn't track their faces. She had learned a long time ago that giving people her eyes was giving them something they hadn't earned. The square filled gradually. Merchants opened their stalls. Children were pulled away from the post by their mothers, then drifted back. An old woman near the dry goods store kept glancing at Lenora with an expression that might have been pity or might have been relief, that private, ugly relief people feel when misfortune has chosen someone else. Lenora was aware of all of it and showed none of it. She had not eaten in 2 days. Her shoulders ached from the position of her arms. Her mouth was dry. When she shifted her weight, the chain rattled, and a few nearby people looked up, as though the sound was interesting. She stopped shifting. The thing about being publicly humiliated, she had discovered, was that it operated on the assumption that you would cooperate. You would flinch, or weep, or plead, and, in doing so, confirm every judgment that had been made against you. Bartholomew Creed understood this. He had designed the sign, the post, the crowd. He had calculated the whole performance around the expectation that Lenora Vance, faced with this level of exposure, would break into pieces that were easy to sweep away. She was not going to cooperate. She heard the dog before she saw it. It was a sound underneath the platform, a low, wet whine, the kind an animal makes when it has been in pain long enough that sound itself has become an effort. Lenora looked down through a gap in the boards and found a dog looking back at her. Brown and white, with one ear folded wrong and a front leg held at an angle that meant it had been hurt for some time. It was so thin she could map its ribs without trying. It had found shade under the platform and was watching her with the careful, measuring expression that animals develop when they have learned to be cautious about people. She had half a piece of bread in her skirt pocket. She'd been saving it not from any particular strategy, just from the instinct that food, once it's gone, doesn't come back. She looked at the dog. She thought about the bread. Then she crouched as far as the chain would allow and worked the bread out of her pocket and dropped it through the gap in the boards. The dog ate it in 2 bites and kept watching her. Lenora straightened back up and returned her gaze to the middle distance. Ronan Mercer had not come to Red Hollow for entertainment. He was 42 years old and had driven his wagon into town at first light with a specific list, seed, harness leather, a new axe handle to replace the one that had finally cracked 2 weeks ago. He was not a man who spent time in town when he didn't have to. Red Hollow had grown uncomfortable for him in the 3 years since his wife Margaret had died, and he handled the discomfort the same way he handled everything, by keeping his head down and his schedule short. He tied his horse at the post outside Bellamy's Hardware and noticed the crowd without paying it much attention. Red Hollow had a habit of gathering around things it shouldn't, and he'd learned not to ask what the occasion was unless he wanted to spend 20 minutes listening to somebody's opinion. He picked up his axe handle first. It was a quick transaction. Bellamy had the right size behind the counter, and they completed the whole thing in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Ronan was back on the street, handle under his arm, heading for the seed merchant, when the quality of the crowd noise changed. Not louder, just different. The way the sound of a group shifts when the thing they're watching does something unexpected. He stopped. Then he walked to where he could see the platform. Ronan Mercer had spent his adult life reading animals and land and weather, and what those things had taught him was that the significant detail was usually the quiet one. Not the storm itself, the specific shape of the cloud that came before it. Not the cattle panicking the single animal at the edge that had gone still. What he saw was this: a woman chained to a public post, surrounded by mockery, who had just given her last piece of food to a starving dog. He stood with that for a moment. Whatever the sign around her neck said, it didn't match what he'd just watched her do. You couldn't fake that. There was no audience for the gesture, no one else had seen it. She hadn't done it for effect. She'd just done it because the dog was hungry and she had something to give. Ronan set his axe handle against a fence post and walked into the square. He moved through the crowd the way he did most things, without hurrying, without announcing himself, just moving steadily in the direction he'd chosen. People stepped aside without quite knowing why. He had that quality, not intimidating, exactly, but solid enough that it simply felt easier to get out of his way. He stopped at the foot of the platform and looked up at the woman. She looked back at him. Her expression didn't change. "What's the evidence against her?" he asked. He hadn't directed the question at anyone in particular. He said it loudly enough that whoever wanted to answer could. A man near the front thick arms, the red face of someone who drinks during the day, turned around. "She stole money, and she helped kill Elias Rourke. Everybody knows it." "Everybody knowing something isn't evidence," Ronan said. "I'm asking about the trial. What court heard this?" The man's jaw moved for a moment without producing sound. He looked at someone beside him. There was a hearing. A different voice offered. Commissioner Peel oversaw it. "Commissioner Peel," Ronan said. He knew the name. Commissioner Peel had been in Creed's debt for going on 4 years, which was a fact Ronan knew because half the county knew it. It wasn't a secret. It was just something people had decided not to say out loud. And Creed was there. It wasn't a question. No one answered it like one. The silence was answer enough. Ronan looked at the woman on the platform again. She still hadn't moved, hadn't changed her expression. She was watching him with a kind of careful attention, not hope, exactly. Something more guarded than hope. The look of someone who has been disappointed enough times to keep their expectations low and their observations high. He turned back to the crowd. What was the evidence? Specifically, look, friend, the red-faced man had taken a step closer. He had the particular confidence of a man who is very certain he represents the majority opinion. "I don't know who you are, but this isn't your business." "I'm making it my business," Ronan said. "The evidence." "What was it?" No one answered. A few people exchanged looks. Someone laughed nervously, the way people do when a situation has shifted into territory they didn't expect. Commissioner Yates, not Peel, but his deputy, a small, pink-eared man in a too large coat, pushed through from the edge of the crowd. He had the practiced fussiness of a bureaucrat who has learned to look important through documentation. "Sir, this woman has been officially processed through the county hearing procedure and placed under public custodial status pending further determination of her case. I would ask you to step back and allow the process to." "Where's the documentation?" Ronan said. "I beg your pardon. The documentation from the hearing. The record of testimony. The evidence submitted." "Where is it?" Deputy Yates blinked rapidly. "Those records are held by the commissioner's office." "Can you produce them?" Not at this moment, no. But Then you've got a woman chained to a post in a public square, and you can't produce the documentation that justifies it. Ronan looked at him steadily. That's not process. That's theater. Yates's mouth opened and closed. The red-faced man had moved closer. Behind him, two others had drifted over hired men. By the look of them, the kind whose job description is unclear and whose income depends on someone else's decisions. You're going to want to think carefully about what you're doing here, the red-faced man said. His voice had dropped into something lower and more direct. Bartholomew Creed takes an interest in this woman's situation. You start interfering with that interest, you're going to find out what that means. Ronan looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the hired men. He did the calculation that men who have lived on isolated land do automatically the specific unsentimental accounting of what a situation might require. Tell Creed, Ronan said, that I said he should produce his documentation or his interest doesn't mean anything. Then he turned to Commissioner Yates. The charge is what? Theft and conspiracy? That is correct, sir, but what's the bail? Or the custodial fee? Whatever the town calls it. Yates blinked again. There is no formal bail set. The case is pending determinations. Then there's nothing official keeping her there. Ronan reached into his coat and came out with a small leather pouch. He counted several coins and threw them deliberately into the dirt at Yates's feet, not aggressively but deliberately. The sound of it was clean and final, for any filing fees or administrative inconvenience. He turned, pulled out his folding knife, and stepped up onto the platform. The crowd went very quiet. Lenora was looking at him. Up close, she was not what he'd expected, which was a thought he recognized as slightly foolish, since he hadn't been expecting anything. She had dark eyes, and the kind of face that had been through something recently, without letting it show. He could see the effort it had cost her, the slight tension in her jaw, the way her breathing was controlled, but not comfortable. You don't have to trust me, he said quietly, so only she could hear. But I'm going to cut these. She studied him for a moment with those measuring eyes. All right, she said. Her voice was steady. He cut the rope. She brought her arms down slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone whose muscles have been locked in one position too long. She didn't grab onto him. She straightened her back and stood on her own feet and pulled the painted sign off over her head with one motion and dropped it on the platform. She looked out at the crowd. The red-faced man had gone red in a different way now. Well, someone in the crowd called out a man's voice, amused and sharp. Mercer's finally gotten desperate enough to take the woman nobody else wanted. Must be a lonely life out there on that ranch. There was laughter. Quite a bit of it. Ronan looked at the crowd. He looked at the specific face of the man who'd said it and found him without difficulty. People who call out from crowds always think they've disappeared, and they never have. He said quietly enough that the laughter didn't quite cover it. Good. Then none of you should mind losing her. He stepped down from the platform and helped Lenora Vance down after him. She was heavy enough that the step required real steadiness on both their parts, and she seemed to know it and didn't make it worse by pretending otherwise. She put her hand on his arm for exactly the second she needed to, and then released it. My horse is at the post by the hardware store, Ronan said. All right, she said again. They walked through the crowd together. People stepped aside, not respectfully, exactly, but with the confused step back of people whose script has been taken away from them. Bartholomew Creed received the news in his office above the Creed Land Management Building on the north end of the main road. The messenger was one of the hired men from the square, hat in hand, delivering the account with the careful word-choosing of someone who is uncertain how bad news will be received. Creed listened without interrupting. He was 57 years old and had the lean, weathered quality of a man who had spent decades getting exactly what he wanted. He was not loud about his power. Loud men, he had observed, often lost their grip because they used it up in performance. Creed's power was quiet, patient, and structural, built into the debts people owed, the contracts they'd signed, the favors they couldn't repay. He had used those tools to dismantle Lenora Vance carefully and methodically over 8 months. The accusation, the hearing, the sign, all of it designed to produce one outcome: a woman so thoroughly discredited that no one would listen to her, and no one would mourn her disappearance from respectable society. Some rancher he didn't recognize had just walked into the square and unraveled 8 months of work in 20 minutes. Creed sat for a moment after the messenger finished. "Find out everything about Ronan Mercer," he said. "Property, debts, neighbors, his business at the bank, everything." The messenger nodded and left. Creed turned to the window that overlooked the main road and watched until he could see the rancher's wagon moving south, the woman beside him on the bench, the yellow-brown dust, lifting behind the wheels. He was not angry. Anger was wasteful. He was focused. The road south out of Red Hollow ran along the base of a low ridge for several miles before it opened into the broader territory where the ranches were spread, and Ronan and Lenora traveled most of it without speaking. He had given her water from his canteen almost immediately after they'd left the square, and she'd drunk half of it and handed it back and said, "Thank you," in the flat, careful way of someone who is watching what they owe. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. Ronan was a man who'd spent a lot of time without company, and Lenora had been around people every minute of the past several days in the worst possible way, and they both seemed to understand that quiet was appropriate for the moment. After maybe 20 minutes, she said, "Why?" He thought about that for a moment. "You gave your last bread to a dog." She looked at him. "I was watching," he said, "from across the square." "That's not a reason to cut someone down from a post," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it was the thing that made me walk over and start asking questions." And nobody could answer a single one. She looked forward at the road. The ridge was falling away to their right now, and the sky had gotten bigger. "I didn't steal anything," she said. Not defensively. Just putting the fact down between them, like something she wanted to be clear about from the start. "I didn't think you did," he said. "You don't know me." "No," he said, "I don't." "Then that's faith, not judgment." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just that I've seen what actual thieves look like, and it's not someone who gives away their last food." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a document. Evidence of what Creed has actually been doing. I hid it before they took me." Ronan glanced at her. "I'm not telling you where," she added. "Not yet. I'm just telling you it exists. Because you should know that you didn't walk into something simple back there." "I didn't think I walked into something simple," he said. "Creed is going to come after you. Probably. And that doesn't—" She stopped. Started again. Most men would hear that and decide they made a mistake. Ronan was quiet for a moment. The horse moved steadily. The wagon wheels found a rough patch, and they both absorbed it without comment. "I've made mistakes before," he said finally. "I generally know what they feel like. This doesn't feel like one." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Then she looked back at the road and didn't say anything else about it. Iron Pine Ranch sat in a shallow natural bowl about 3 miles from the main road, protected on the north side by a stand of pine trees that had given it its name. It was a working property, not prosperous, exactly, but functional. The fences were maintained. The barn had a good roof. The garden that ran along the east side of the house had gone somewhat neglected, Lenora noticed, the beds overgrown in a way that said months rather than weeks. She noticed other things too. The house was clean inside, but sparse in the way men's houses get when there's no one competing for the space. Nothing on the walls. Dishes stacked practically rather than arranged. Coat on the hook by the door that had been hanging there long enough to take the shape of its last wearing. Ronan showed her the spare room without ceremony. There was a bed, a chest, and a window that faced east. "You can clean up first," he said. "I'll start something for supper." She set her hand on the doorframe and turned around. "I should tell you up front. I'm not going to be charity." He looked at her. "All right. I mean it. I'll work. Whatever this place needs. I can cook. I can do fence work. I can handle horses. I'm stronger than I look." "You look pretty strong," he said. She studied him for a moment, trying to find condescension in it and not finding any. "All right," she said. "The garden needs work," he offered. "And the horses don't like anyone, but that's their problem, not yours." She almost smiled. "Almost. I'll introduce myself to them tomorrow." She went into the room and closed the door and stood alone for the first time in what felt like years and let herself breathe, really breathe, from the bottom the way you can't when people are watching. She was not safe. She knew that clearly. Creed was not a man who let things go. But she was out of chains. She was inside, and tomorrow she would start figuring out how to finish what Elias Rourke had died trying to start. That was enough for tonight. 3 days passed before the first test came. Lenora had established herself at Iron Pine with the efficiency of someone who cannot afford to be a burden and knows it. The garden was her first project. She went at it with a persistence that surprised Ronan, who had offered help twice and been told, both times, that she had it. She did have it. Within 2 days, the beds were cleared, the borders restaked, and she'd begun repairing the irrigation channels that had been letting water run wrong. She learned the horses' names from a board Ronan had nailed inside the barn and approached each one with slow, methodical patience. The gray gelding named Casper was the worst. He bit at air and stamped and swung his hind quarters at anyone who came too close. Lenora spent half a morning just standing at his stall with her back to him, not asking anything, not moving, until he came and put his nose on her shoulder to see what she was. After that, he was manageable. Ronan watched these things without commenting on them. He'd started giving her more of the ranch's accounts to review, partly because she'd asked to understand the operation, and partly because he'd discovered in their first working supper that her mind for numbers was remarkable. She could hear a set of figures once, and hold them, compare them, find the irregularities. She told him, on the 4th night, about how she'd found Creed's scheme. She'd been teaching in Red Hollow for 3 years. Good work. She'd liked it, liked the children, liked the slow accumulation of being trusted in a community. Parents had started bringing her their documents when they couldn't understand them, which happened often because Creed's contract language was designed to be confusing. She'd translated 5 contracts into plain language before she noticed the pattern, the interest terms, the adjustment clauses buried in the 3rd and 4th pages. Language that would have been incomprehensible to anyone without legal training, and that translated to, if you miss 2 payments, your property reverts to the lender's holding company at assessed value, not market value. Creed had assessed value himself. Elias Rourke was the county surveyor, she said. They were at the kitchen table, the remains of supper between them, the lamp turning the room amber. He was doing a routine survey of the Halbert property, one of the families affected, and he found the discrepancies in the recorded boundaries. The property had been drawn smaller on the county records than it actually was, which meant when Creed foreclosed and assessed it, he assessed a smaller plot than he actually took. He was taking extra land on top of the foreclosure, Ronan said. 14 properties. I matched them all. Survey records, original contracts, Creed's recorded foreclosures. The numbers don't lie. Elias found this too. He found the survey side. I had the contract side. He came to me because someone told him I'd been helping families understand their paperwork. She looked at the table for a moment. He was a careful man. He made copies. He gave them to me 3 days before he died. Ronan let the silence sit for a moment before he asked, how'd he die? They said he fell off the ridge at Boundary Creek while doing survey work. Her voice didn't change when she said it. Elias Rourke had been surveying that specific territory for 11 years. He knew every inch of the ridge at Boundary Creek, and you hid the documents. The night before Creed's men came for me, I had just enough warning. She finally looked up. Someone in his organization tipped me. I don't know who or why. Maybe conscience. Maybe they didn't know what they were starting. But I got the documents out of my house and hidden before they arrived. She told him where, then not the exact location, but the general territory. Enough for him to understand what reaching them would require. Ronan thought about everything she'd said for a long moment. You've been holding all of this alone, he said. Yes, months. I wasn't going to let him have it, she said. Simply, as if it were obvious. He took everything else. My job, my name, my house. 8 months of my life, chained or locked or publicly displayed for people to mock. She paused. The documents were the one thing he couldn't get. I wasn't going to let him have that. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. A horse shifted in the barn. Bracken, who had followed them from town and arrived at Iron Pine 2 days after they did, limping and determined, and had been accepted by Ronan with the sigh of a man who recognizes inevitability, lifted his head from his place beside the stove and set it back down. All right, Ronan said. Then we figure out how to get them to the right people. Lenora looked at him across the table. You keep saying we, she said. I do, he agreed. Why? He thought about that honestly. Because you're right that it's wrong. And because doing nothing when you know something's wrong is a choice, it's just a coward's choice. He paused. And because I've been making that choice for 3 years, with a lot of things, and I'm a little tired of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, all right. We, the hired men, came on the 6th day. 3 of them, mid-morning, riding up the main track to Iron Pine without particular hurry. They carried themselves like men who are used to arriving places and having the arrival mean something. Lenora was in the barn when she heard them. She moved to the barn door and watched through the gap. Ronan had come out of the house and was standing in the yard with his arms at his side. The lead rider, a solid man in a gray coat who carried a folded paper like a prop, held it out at a distance that required Ronan to come closer to take it. Ronan didn't come closer. What is it? He said. Warrant, the man said. For the woman. Property recovery and witness compliance. Let me see the signature. The man held it out again. Ronan walked forward and took it, and read it carefully, not quickly, not performatively. Actually read it. The way a man reads something he expects to contain a lie and wants to find it. He folded it and held it back out. Commissioner Peel's signature on a warrant that's dated 6 days before the incident it supposedly references, he said. That's not a warrant. That's a piece of paper. Someone filled out wrong on purpose. So the date, Ronan said. Look at the date. It's dated the 14th. The hearing that supposedly established the grounds for this warrant was held on the 20th. A warrant can't predate its own justification. The lead rider's jaw tightened. I'll need to verify. You can verify it anywhere you like, Ronan said. But not here and not with her. Ride back the way you came. The 3 men looked at each other. One of them younger, at the edge of the group, glanced toward the barn. Lenora stepped back from the gap. Mr. Mercer, the lead rider said, in a tone that was trying to be reasonable without quite committing to it. Mr. Creed's patience isn't unlimited. The woman has information that belongs to the county. Cooperation now is in everyone's interest. Cooperation, Ronan said, tasting the word. You rode onto my property with a fraudulent warrant, and you're asking me about cooperation. Silence. Ride back, Ronan said again. After a long moment, the lead rider turned his horse. The other 2 followed. They moved without hurrying, preserving what dignity they could back down the main track. Ronan waited until they were out of sight before he turned toward the barn. Lenora came out. That won't be the end of it, she said. No, he agreed. That was just Creed, finding out where the property line is. He went back inside. Lenora stood in the yard for a moment longer, watching the empty track. Bracken came out of the barn, stood beside her, and looked in the same direction. I know, she told him. She went back inside too. The night after Creed's men left Iron Pine, Ronan couldn't sleep. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch, the pine trees moving in the wind, Bracken shifting near the stove downstairs, the occasional creak of the spare room floorboards that told him Lenora wasn't sleeping either. He thought about the warrant. The date error hadn't been accidental. Creed was too careful for accidents. It had been a test, a probe to see how Ronan would react, whether he'd read the document at all, whether he was the kind of man who would be intimidated by official-looking paper, even when the paper was wrong. Ronan had passed that particular test, but he understood that Creed was patient. He hadn't built what he'd built by losing his focus after one setback. Fraudulent warrant was just information gathering. The next thing would be something different. He got up before dawn and started coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil and wrote down everything he knew about Creed's operation, what he'd heard over years in town, what Lenora had told him, what he'd inferred from the patterns. It was more than he expected when he saw it laid out. Red Hollow had known about Creed, the way people know about weather. They could describe it, they understood its effects, but they'd stopped thinking about whether anything could be done about it. Lenora came downstairs while the coffee was still brewing. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him at the table. Couldn't sleep, he said without looking up. No, she said. She poured 2 cups when the coffee was ready and set one in front of him and sat across the table. She looked at what he'd written. He turned the paper so she could read it. She studied it for a long time. You've known about some of this for years, she said, in pieces. The way you know things when you don't want to look at them directly. She set the paper back down. Most people in Red Hollow know in pieces. Yes. But knowing and doing anything about it are two different problems, she said. Creed is careful. He doesn't threaten people directly. He adjusts their credit terms. He stops speaking to them at the saloon. He mentions casually to the right banker that a man's land has some unresolved boundary questions. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He makes the cost of opposing him feel like it accumulates naturally. Like weather, the way you said. Nobody causes it. It just gets colder. Ronan looked at her. You said that the way you've thought about it for a while. 8 months in a cell gives you time to understand your enemy, she said flatly. He didn't say anything to that. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was turning from black to the dark gray that comes just before color returns to the world. Bracken got up from beside the stove, walked to the door, looked at Ronan, and walked back to the stove. Not yet, Ronan told him. Does he always do that? Lenora asked. Every morning. He thinks he should be involved in any decisions made on the property. He's not wrong, she said. Bracken's tail moved once. Lenora almost smiled again. It was the same almost as before, quick and unfinished, like a door that opens a crack and then remembers itself. Ronan noticed it and didn't say anything about it. He was developing a sense for what she'd accept and what would make her pull back, and commenting on her expressions fell clearly in the second category. I need to tell you something, she said. The almost smile was gone. About why Creed moved when he did, 8 months ago. Ronan waited. The families I was helping understand their contracts, I'd found 5 of them by then, maybe 6. Enough that I was starting to understand the full pattern, but not enough to prove it in any court. She turned her cup in a slow circle on the table. Elias Rourke came to me on a Wednesday. We spent 4 hours comparing his survey records against the contracts I had. By Thursday night, we knew we had enough for 14 properties, and that was just what we could document. The real number was probably double. And Creed found out, Ronan said. Elias died on Saturday, she said. Fell off the Boundary Creek Ridge. 2 days. 2 days. She stopped turning the cup. Someone in Creed's circle knew Elias had been to see me. Either we were watched, or someone talked, or Elias told someone he trusted, and that person wasn't trustworthy. She paused. I'll never know which. But by Sunday morning, I'd received a word through a neighbor, no name, just a message that men were coming for me. And you got the documents out. I rode out to the hiding place at midnight, got back, changed my clothes, was sitting at my kitchen table when they knocked on my door at sunrise. She looked at him directly. I didn't run. I thought about it. But if I ran, Creed would know exactly why, and the documents would be useless because everyone would believe I'd stolen them or falsified them. My only chance was to be accused publicly and survive it long enough for someone with authority to actually look at the evidence. That was a long bet, Ronan said. It was the only bet I had. He thought about that. The specific kind of courage required to sit at your kitchen table waiting for men to come arrest you, knowing you are not guilty, knowing no one will believe you, deciding to hold your ground anyway. What happened to your neighbor? He asked. The one who brought the warning. Something shifted in her expression, so brief he almost missed it. She moved her family to Nebraska 2 weeks after my arrest. I don't blame her. She has 4 children. Ronan drank his coffee and said nothing. Creed didn't come for me because I was a threat he'd underestimated, Lenora said. He came for me because I was a threat he'd identified at exactly the right moment. He moved fast and he moved hard, and he used everything he knew about how this town sees a woman who looks like me. She said the last part without inflection, like stating a measurement. He knew a large woman without family money or a husband's protection would have exactly no one stand up for her. He calculated it. It was part of his plan. He calculated wrong, Ronan said. You were a variable he didn't account for, she said. Nobody accounts for variables they've never seen before. He looked at her across the table in the early morning half-dark. That's a generous interpretation of what I did, he said. It's an accurate one, she said. Don't mistake accuracy for generosity. The town's response came slower than a frontal assault and hit harder. It started with the feed merchant, a man named Coghill, who'd sold Ronan seed and grain for 9 years without a significant problem between them. Ronan drove in for supplies 8 days after bringing Lenora back to Iron Pine and found Coghill behind his counter with the careful blankness of a man who has been told something and is trying to look like he thought of it himself. I'm going to need payment in full, before I can extend your spring order, Coghill said. Ronan looked at him. We've had a standing credit arrangement for 9 years. I know that, Coghill said, and he did look genuinely uncomfortable, which was the most honest thing in the room. There's been a review of outstanding accounts. Policy change. Policy change, Ronan said. That's right. Ronan put his hands in his pockets and looked around the store for a moment. The barrels, the shelving, the other customer on the far side, who was studying a wall of harness hooks with excessive concentration. Is this Creed's idea of a policy change or yours? He said. Coghill's face went a shade redder. I don't know what you're. I'm not going to argue with you about it, Ronan said. You're scared, and that's understandable. But you know what you're doing, and I know what you're doing, and pretending otherwise is wasting both our time. He put cash on the counter, the full amount for what he needed, which he'd had the foresight to bring. I'll take the supplies. He took them and drove home and told Lenora what had happened without embellishment. She sat with it for a moment. How many merchants can do that to you before it becomes a real problem? 3 or 4 months before the credit situation gets serious, he said, depending on what Creed targets next. The bank, she said. Probably your mortgage. I don't have one, he said. Paid off in '84. But there are land tax records, easement agreements, water rights documentation. He paused. A man like Creed can find something in any paperwork if he looks long enough. She nodded slowly. He's done it to 11 other families. He knows exactly where to look. The next day, 2 of Ronan's neighboring ranchers' men he'd shared fence-line labor with for years, the kind of relationship built on small shared burdens rather than friendship, exactly rode past the Iron Pine turnoff without stopping in. He'd expected them. They had their own families, their own mortgages, their own calculations to make. He didn't blame them. He told Lenora he didn't blame them. You don't have to convince me, she said. I've had more time than you to stop being surprised by it. She was repairing the east fence that afternoon, pulling the old wire taut and stapling it clean, working steadily in a way that would have surprised anyone who believed the town's version of her. Ronan watched her for a moment from across the yard and thought about the gap between the story Red Hollow had told about this woman and the actual person driving fence staples with practiced efficiency in the heat of the afternoon. Creed had built that gap deliberately, with the sign, with the public chaining, with the accumulated weight of mockery and mockery and mockery, until a whole town looked at one person and saw only what they'd been told to see. It made Ronan angry in a quiet, settled way. Not the hot kind of anger that makes men do stupid things. Cold kind that stays. The social pressure followed the economic pressure within the week. He went into town. For the grain mill, one of the few merchants Creed didn't have significant leverage over. A stubborn German-born man named Strauss, who'd been milling grain in Red Hollow since before Creed had moved his operation in, and who had a documented and apparently personal resistance to being told what to do, and at the saloon afterward. Where he'd gone for one drink and information, the table he usually sat at was occupied by men who'd known him for years, and who found reasons to look somewhere else when he came in. One of them, a rancher named Pelham, a man Ronan had helped pull cattle out of a frozen creek 3 winters ago, eventually walked over. He stood with his glass and his discomfort and said quietly, Ronan, you know what you've gotten yourself into. I know what I've gotten myself into, Ronan agreed. Creed's not going to let this go. You know that. I know that too. Pelham looked at him. He was a decent man in the way that many men are decent, meaning he would do the right thing as long as it didn't cost him significantly. He had 3 kids and a wife and a mortgage that Creed held, and all of that was visible in his face. The woman, Pelham said. People are saying, look, I'm just telling you what people are saying. They're saying she had you fooled. That Creed's got documents showing she really did help with Rourke. Does Creed have documents showing that? I don't know what Creed has. Does anyone actually believe that, or are they saying it because Creed wants them to say it? Pelham was quiet. Right, Ronan said. He finished his drink. Tell me something, Pelham. When you pulled that calf last February, the one that was coming wrong, and the mother couldn't manage it, and you were in that barn until 2 in the morning, and you asked me to come help. Did you ask because you thought I was the kind of man who makes bad judgments about things that matter? Pelham looked down at his glass. No, then trust what you know instead of what you're being told, Ronan said. He set his glass down and stood up. That's not a complicated calculation. He walked out. He didn't look back to see Pelham's expression, but he heard the silence he left behind him, and it had a different quality than the silence when he'd walked in. On the 12th day, the young deputy marshal rode up to Iron Pine at dusk. He came alone, which was the first unusual thing. He came without the county insignia visible on his coat, which was the second. He tied his horse at the fence, rather than riding into the yard, which was the third. Ronan saw him from the porch and didn't say anything. He let the young man walk up. Everett Sloane was 26 years old and had the specific look of a man who has not been sleeping. His face was thin under a week's growth of beard, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him, like a man in a situation where he doesn't know what to do with his hands. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "Deputy Sloane," Ronan said. Everett looked at the door. Is Miss Vance here?" "She is. I need to talk to her. To both of you." He stopped. "I know I have no right to walk onto your property and ask that. I know exactly what position I'm in, but I'm asking anyway." Ronan studied him for a long moment. He had a good sense for men performing contrition versus men actually inside it, and Everett Sloane had the look of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for long enough that he didn't care anymore about the appearance of it. "Come in," Ronan said. Lenora was at the kitchen table. When they came in, she'd been reviewing the ranch accounts, which she'd taken over with a thoroughness that still slightly surprised Ronan. She looked up when she saw Everett Sloane, and everything in her face went flat, and still in the way that's not the absence of emotion, but the hard management of too much of it. She knew who he was. Everett stood inside the door and didn't try to sit down. That was the right instinct. "Miss Vance," he said, "I owe you a straight account of what I did and didn't do. You can decide what to do with it after." She said nothing. She put her pencil down on the table. She waited. Everett took a breath. "I was in that hearing. Commissioner Peel's hearing. I was the ranking law presence in the room, which means I had an obligation to raise questions about the evidence being presented." He stopped. Started again. "There was no real evidence. You know that. Creed had testimony from 2 men who'd been in his employ for 3 years, and he had some letters that I could see they were wrong. The handwriting in the letters, he said, were yours. I'd seen your actual handwriting on town documents. It wasn't the same. The room was very quiet. And I didn't say anything," Everett said. Lenora's hands were flat on the table. "I told myself it wasn't my place to contradict the commissioner," he said. "I told myself the territorial marshal's office would review it. I told myself somebody else would catch it." He looked directly at her. "I knew it was wrong while I was doing it. Every one of those things I told myself was something I knew was a lie while I was telling it." "Why?" she said. Her voice was careful. "Why are you here now?" "Because Creed called me into his office 3 days ago," Everett said. "He wanted me to come out here with a warrant and bring you back. A real warrant this time. He'd had Commissioner Peel sign it proper, with the dates corrected." He paused. He explained what he needed from me. Very clearly. Very specifically. "And you didn't do it," Ronan said. "No." Everett turned his hat in his hands. Hearing him explain what he needed me to do, the exact steps. What to say to you, how to manage it. I don't know how to explain it, except that I heard myself in what he was describing. Every choice I'd made at that hearing. He'd done the exact same thing to me that he did to Peel, and every other person in this county. He'd let me compromise myself just far enough that he could ask for a little more, and I'd have to cooperate or expose myself. "That's his pattern," Lenora said. "Yes, I understand that now." She looked at him for a long time. Her expression had shifted, not softened exactly, but moved. The kind of movement in a person's face that happens when they are reassessing information they thought they already understood completely. "I'm not going to forgive you tonight," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I'm not asking for that," he said. "Good." She looked down at the table for a moment, then back up. "But I want to know everything about what Creed told you. Every detail. Who he mentioned, what he said he needed, what his timeline is." Everett nodded. "That's why I came." He sat down then finally, and they talked for 2 hours. Came out in pieces, the way honest accounting always does. Creed had told Everett he needed the documents Lenora had hidden within the next 30 days. The territorial legislature was holding a land rights review in Cheyenne the following month, and Creed had 3 of the affected properties cases scheduled for final determination at that review. If the documents surfaced in Cheyenne before that review, his entire land-holding structure across 3 counties would collapse. 30 days. That's why he came after you when he did, Ronan said to Lenora. The timing, she said. I didn't know about the legislative review. That's the piece I was missing. He's not just protecting past fraud, Ronan said slowly. He's protecting future fraud. The review in Cheyenne, if those 3 properties get finalized in his name, they become a legal foundation for the next round of foreclosures. And if we get the documents to the right authority in Cheyenne before that review, then the review can't finalize anything, Lenora said. The territorial attorney's office would have to suspend all proceedings pending investigation. Everett was watching both of them. I can get you to someone in Cheyenne. A territorial attorney named Malcolm Dyer, he's clean. I know that because Creed mentioned him once as a problem. A man like Creed only calls someone a problem when they can't be bought. Lenora looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Lenora. We need the documents first, she said. Yes, he agreed. They were both aware that retrieving the documents meant leaving Iron Pine, moving through open territory, and arriving at a location Creed's men didn't know about yet, all of which was possible, none of which was safe. I can ride with you, Everett said. I have a badge. It's worth something, even in Creed's county, if I'm present and official. The badge you were wearing at that hearing, Lenora said. He absorbed that. Yes. Then you understand why I need a moment before I answer that. Yes, he said again. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood with her back to both of them. Outside, the last of the evening light was dying over the ridge. Bracken came and sat beside her and put his head against her leg, which he'd started doing sometime in the second week without announcement. She stood there for a while. Ronan didn't speak. He poured more coffee and set a cup in Everett's direction and let the silence be what it needed to be. Finally, Lenora turned around. One chance, she said to Everett. You get one chance to correct what you helped build. You understand that's what this is. Not absolution. Chance to do the work that you should have done in that hearing room. I understand, Everett said. If you hesitate at the wrong moment, she said, it won't just cost you. It'll cost Ronan, and it'll cost 14 families who've already lost everything they had. You understand that too? Yes. She studied him for one more long moment. All right, she said. We ride in 4 days. That gives us time to plan the route and gives you time to arrange your absence without Creed's people tracking it. She sat back down at the table and picked up her pencil. Tell me the road conditions between here and Willow Run this time of year, she said to Ronan. The northern route, not the main road. Ronan pulled the table's lamp closer and started drawing a rough map. Everett watched the two of them, the rancher and the teacher, bent over the kitchen table in the lamplight, working the problem, and felt something in himself that was not quite hope and not quite relief, and was definitely not yet absolution. It was something more complicated than any of those things. It was the particular sensation of being inside a choice that matters, after a long time of choosing things that didn't. He picked up his coffee and listened, and when they asked him questions, he answered them as honestly as he knew how. Outside, the wind had come up from the north, and the pine trees were moving, and Red Hollow sat 10 miles away in its valley with its lights coming on one by one in the dark. And Bartholomew Creed was in his office above the land management building, and he didn't know yet what was forming at Iron Pine Ranch around a kitchen table with a lamp and a rough hand-drawn map. He would find out, but not tonight, and by the time he did, the window he'd counted on having would be a great deal smaller than he'd planned. Lenora kept her eyes on the map and kept her voice level and kept moving forward the way she had been moving forward for 8 months, not because it was easy and not because she wasn't afraid, but because the only alternative was to let Creed have the last word. And that was the one thing she had decided, at the kitchen table of her own house on the night before his men came for her, that she was never going to let him do. The 4 days passed in the specific way that days pass, when everyone involved knows something is coming and no one says it out loud more than necessary. Everett rode back to town the night of their meeting and didn't return until the morning of the 3rd day, when he came with his badge tucked inside his coat and a packed saddlebag, and the look of a man who had done something irreversible and had made his peace with it. He told them he'd filed a routine patrol report with the county office that would account for his absence for 5 days. Creed's people would check, but a patrol report was ordinary enough not to trigger questions for at least 3 days. 3 days was what they had. Lenora spent those 4 days finishing the things that needed finishing. She completed the fence repair on the east side and put the garden beds in an order that would survive a week without attention. She organized Ronan's accounts into a ledger that someone else could follow if they needed to. She did all of this without explaining why, and Ronan didn't ask, because he understood the same impulse from his own life, the need to leave things ordered before walking into something uncertain. On the night before they were to leave, she sat with Bracken on the porch steps for a long time after supper. The dog had filled out in the weeks at Iron Pine. His ribs were no longer a map, and the front leg that had been held wrong had straightened with rest and decent food. He sat pressed against her thigh with his chin on her knee, and she rested her hand on his head and looked at the dark shapes of the pines against the sky. Ronan came out and sat on the step above her with his coffee. "He'll be all right here for a few days," he said. "I asked the Strauss boy to come by and feed him." "I know," she said. "He might worry. Dogs do," she said. "It passes." They sat in the quiet for a while. A coyote called somewhere north of the ridge and went unanswered. "If something goes wrong out there," Lenora said, not looking at him, "and we don't make it to Cheyenne, the documents are in an oilcloth-wrapped metal box under a flat creek stone beside a split cedar at the north edge of the Halbert homestead near Willow Run. You remember that? Nothing's going to go wrong," he said. "Ronan." "I remember," he said. "Flat creek stone, split cedar, north edge." She nodded once. "Same information goes for you," he said. "If something happens, and I'm not in a position to know where my property deed is. The mortgage is clear. If Creed tries to make a claim on Iron Pine after Minot's, nothing's going to go wrong," she said, using his words back at him. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. They sat until the coyote called again, closer this time, and Bracken lifted his head and rumbled low in his chest and then settled back down. "I've been thinking about Elias Rourke," Lenora said. "He had a sister in Laramie. I wrote to her 6 months ago from the cell, but I don't know if the letter got out." "If we make it to Cheyenne when?" Ronan said. "When we make it to Cheyenne," she said, accepting the correction, "I want to make sure she knows what her brother found and why it mattered. Not just the legal part, the part about what kind of man he was." "We'll make sure of it," Ronan said. She looked up at the stars for a moment. Then she stood up and brushed off her skirt and told Bracken to go inside, which he did with the dignity of a dog who has decided to cooperate. She went in after him. Ronan sat on the porch alone for a while longer, finishing his coffee and thinking about the road north, and not letting himself think too hard about what Creed might already know. They left before first light. Ronan rode his bay gelding and led a pack horse with supplies. Lenora rode the gray Casper, who had decided over the past 3 weeks that she was acceptable company and expressed this by merely flattening his ears when she saddled him, rather than attempting actual violence. Everett rode his own horse and kept to the left side of the track, which was the natural position for a man watching the tree line. The northern route added 2 hours to the journey, but kept them off the main Cheyenne road for the critical middle section. Ronan had used it before for moving cattle and knew its particular difficulties, a creek crossing that was deeper than it looked, a stretch of rocky ground that slowed horses to a careful walk, a ridge section where the trail narrowed to single file and the footing was loose shale. He kept the pace steady and didn't push it. For the first hour, no one talked much. The horse's breath showed in the cold morning air, and the sky went through its slow changes from black to gray to the fragile pale color that comes just before the sun commits to rising. Lenora rode with her back straight and her eyes moving, checking the tree line the same way Everett was, without having been told to. Everett noticed. "You've thought about this kind of situation before," he said to her. "Not accusatory, just observational." "I thought about it for 8 months," she said. "When you have enough time to think, you cover a lot of ground." "What did you—" He stopped himself. "Tried again. What kept you going? In the cell, I mean." Before any of this, she looked at him sideways. The question hung in the air while she decided how to answer it. "Anger," she said finally, "and the documents. Knowing they were out there. Knowing that Creed needed me to reveal where they were, which meant as long as I didn't tell him, I had the one thing he wanted. She paused. A person can survive a lot on that, on being the one person holding something the other side needs. Everett was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry I was in that room, he said. I've said it before, but you'll stop being sorry. She said, when you've done something that earns it. We're not there yet. No, he agreed. Keep watching the tree line, she said. He turned back to the left and watched the tree line. They reached the creek crossing at mid-morning. Ronan dismounted and waded it first knee-deep at the center, running fast from 3 days of rain earlier in the week, the bottom slick with algae-covered stones. He came back and took Casper's bridle and walked him across while Lenora sat the saddle with her weight balanced correctly and let the horse work under her without fighting him. Casper didn't like it. His ears went flat and his feet moved with the particular stiff reluctance of a horse that is deeply unhappy but has decided to cooperate anyway. Lenora kept her weight even and her hands light and talked to him in a low, continuous voice that wasn't quite words, just sound, just presence, just the consistent message that she was still there and the situation was manageable. They made it across. The pack horse was easier. Everett's gelding crossed without issue. They stopped on the far bank for 10 minutes to let the horses settle and eat something from the packs. Ronan checked the back trail while Lenora rewrapped the bread she'd brought against the damp. We're being followed, Ronan said. He said it the same way he'd say the weather was turning. Calm, factual like a report. Both Lenora and Everett turned to look at the trail behind them. Since when? Everett said. I saw movement on the ridge south of the creek crossing before we went down into the ravine. 2 riders, maybe 3, staying back enough to be careful but not far enough to be invisible. Creed's people, Lenora said. Or county men, Everett said, with a tightness in his voice that said he was working through what that meant for his patrol report. If someone checked earlier than I expected, either way, Ronan said, they'll want to see where we're going. If they knew where the documents were, they'd have retrieved them already, which means they're following us to find out. Lenora thought about this quickly. We can't lead them to Willow Run. No, Ronan agreed. Detour, Everett said. We could move north toward Harker's Pass, make it look like we're heading for the territorial road. That adds 4 hours, Ronan said. 4 hours we have, Lenora said. Documents we can't replace. Ronan looked at her, looked at the ridge, looked at his horse. All right, he said. Harker's Pass first. We'll see if they follow the misdirection or cut back toward Willow Run on their own. If they cut back on their own, Everett said they already know. They already know, Ronan said. We have a different problem. Nobody said what that problem would be. They saddled up and rode north. Followers stayed with them for 2 hours before peeling off. Ronan tracked the movement on the high ridge through the intermittent gaps in the tree cover 2 riders, moving parallel, maintaining distance. When the trail curved northwest toward Harker's Pass and kept curving, the riders stopped on the ridge for a long time. He could just make out the shapes of them against the sky. Then they turned and rode south. They're going back, he said. To report? Lenora asked. To report, or to go ahead to the main road and wait for us to come through? He thought about it. The main road is unavoidable on the last stretch to Cheyenne. They know that. Then we don't take the last stretch, Everett said. He looked at Ronan. There's a territorial marshal's way station at Clover Fork, 8 miles east of the main road. If I ride ahead and reach it, I can get word to Dyer in Cheyenne. He could send... How long? Lenora said. Riding hard from the way station. 24 hours. Maybe less. And between now and then, we're in open territory with the documents and 2 men who know where we are. 3 of us, Ronan said. Against 2 or 3 of them, if that's still the count. We don't know what the count is anymore, Lenora said. She was right. They'd seen 2 riders on the ridge. That told them nothing about who was already ahead of them. They rode in tighter formation after that, Ronan in front and Everett at the rear, and Lenora in the middle, which she'd accepted without comment, despite the obvious implication that she was being protected. She understood the geometry of it, and she understood that the documents she was carrying, which she'd kept inside her coat against her body, wrapped in their oilcloth, since Ronan had retrieved them from the Halbert homestead 2 hours earlier, were the center of the whole operation. She was the center of the whole operation. The positioning made tactical sense, and she wasn't going to argue with tactical sense to satisfy her pride. That was what she told herself. She was also aware that her hands were not entirely steady, which she'd noticed during the creek crossing and had not mentioned to anyone. It was not fear, exactly. It was the accumulated weight of being in motion towards something that mattered enormously, after months of being static and helpless. Her body was processing the difference. She kept her hands on the reins and her face forward and breathed through it. They reached the outer edge of the Halbert homestead at midday. The abandoned house sat in a shallow clearing. The roof had partially collapsed on the east side. The windows were empty, and the yard had gone entirely to grass. A family had built this, she thought, had lived here and worked here, and lost it to Creed's fine print. There was a child's boot near the collapsed porch step. One boot, brown leather, worn down at the toe. Lenora looked at it and then looked away. Split Cedar was at the north edge of the property, where the land dropped toward the creek, easy to find once you knew it, invisible if you didn't. The tree had been struck by lightning years ago and had healed into a distinct forked shape, and the flat creek stone was beside the larger root at its base. Ronan found the stone and crouched down. He worked it loose from the mud. With both hands it was heavier than it looked, requiring real effort, the kind of thing a person who found it by accident would have given up on before they got anywhere. Beneath it, in a hollow in the clay, was the box. Metal, wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Still dry, he lifted it and handed it to Lenora. She took it and stood with it for a moment without opening it. "You need to look," Ronan said. "Make sure everything is still there." She nodded. She sat down on the creek bank and opened the oilcloth with careful hands. Inside the box was packed with folded papers, Elias Rourke's survey notes, and his precise, careful hand, her own handwritten copies of 14 contracts, and a letter from Elias she'd never been able to bring herself to read all the way through. She went through each document methodically, counting, cross-referencing, making sure nothing was water-damaged or missing. "It's all here," she said. Ronan let out a breath. Everett sat on his horse and watched the tree line. Lenora wrapped the documents back in the oilcloth and placed them inside her coat. She stood up and brushed the clay off her hands and looked at the split cedar for a moment. "All right, Elias," she said, quietly, to the tree and the creek and the empty homestead behind her. "You're going." Ronan pretended not to hear. Everett definitely heard, but kept his eyes on the tree line. They were an hour from the Clover Fork way station when everything shifted. The sound was wrong first. The birds in the timber ahead of them had gone quiet in a specific way, the way they go quiet when something larger than normal has moved through. Ronan felt it before he consciously registered it, the same instinct that had saved him from at least 2 bad situations in his life, and he raised his hand. Stopped. The road ahead curved around a limestone outcropping. Whatever was on the far side of that curve was not visible from where they stood. "How many ways around the outcropping?" Lenora asked, very quietly. "1," Ronan said. "Through the timber to the east, but that's 2 miles and thick going." "Or we go through them," Everett said. His voice had changed, tighter, lower. His hand had moved to rest near his holster. "We don't know how many Ronan started." "I'll go around the outcropping first," Everett said, alone with the badge visible. If it's Creed's men, they won't move against a deputy marshal in daylight on the territorial road. Not without significantly more justification than following 3 riders. "You don't know that," Lenora said. "No," he said. "But Creed is careful. He doesn't create obvious incidents. He manipulates paperwork and process. Having his men assault a deputy marshal on a public road is too visible. He had men surround a ranch at 2 in the morning, Lenora said. That's different. Iron Pine is private property. Out here." Everett gestured at the open road. "There are rules he's still following." Ronan looked at the outcropping, looked at Everett. "Badge visible," he said. "Badge visible," Everett confirmed. He opened his coat and let the badge catch the flat afternoon light. Then he rode forward at a steady, deliberate pace, the walk of a man on official business who has every right to be exactly where he is. Ronan and Lenora waited. 30 seconds, a minute. A sound from beyond the outcropping, voices low, the sound of horses moving. Then quiet again. Then Everett's voice. It's clear. They rode around the limestone and found 4 men on horseback ranged across the road, and Everett sitting his horse between them and the path forward, his badge bright on his chest, his posture completely still. 4 men were Creed's. Lenora recognized one of them from the ranch, the lead rider from the fraudulent warrant visit, the solid man in the gray coat. He was looking at her with an expression that was carefully neutral, which told her everything. Deputy Sloan, Gray Coat said, didn't realize you were out this direction. Patrol, Everett said. Filed with the county office. All in order. Who are your companions? Private citizens on lawful travel, Everett said. Same road you're on. A pause. Gray Coat's eyes moved from Everett to Ronan to Lenora. They stayed on Lenora a beat too long, Miss Vance, he said. She looked at him. Mr. Creed would very much appreciate a conversation, he said. Mr. Creed can request a conversation through the appropriate legal channels, she said. He knows where to find them. The documents you're carrying are county property, he said. You should know that recovering them is fully within our. I'm carrying personal correspondence and my own legal records, she said. You're welcome to produce documentation describing any county property I'm alleged to have, and Deputy Sloan can review it. Gray Coat looked at Everett. Everett's expression was pleasant and entirely immovable. Produce the documentation, Everett said. I'll review it. Another pause. Longer this time, there was no documentation. They all knew there was no documentation, because producing real documentation required going through the territorial system, and going through the territorial system required revealing what the documents contained and why Creed wanted them. Gray Coat's jaw moved once. Then he looked at Lenora with the specific expression of a man who is calculating a later date. Safe travels, he said. He turned his horse. The other three followed. They moved off the road and disappeared into the timber. Lenora watched until the last sound of their horses faded. They'll go back to Creed, Ronan said. Yes, she said. He'll know we have the documents. He already suspected, she said. Now he knows. She looked at Everett. That was well done. Everett released a slow breath. My hands are shaking, he said, with the frankness of someone who is done performing composure. Mine were shaking at the creek crossing, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of something shared. Keep moving, Ronan said. Clover Fork is an hour. They reached the way station as the sun was getting low. It was a modest structure, a single large room, with a stove, a table, and a rack of territorial maps on the wall. A station master named Birch, a compact, weathered man of about 50, who had clearly seen enough things in his years to stop being surprised by much, looked at the three of them when they came in trail dirty, saddle-tired, carrying the specific tension of people who've been watched all day and put a kettle on without being asked. Need to send a message to Cheyenne, Everett said. Territorial Attorney Dyer. Urgent, official, and private. Birch looked at the badge. Looked at Ronan, looked at Lenora. I'll get the book, he said. Everett wrote the message himself, standing at the station master's table, while Lenora and Ronan sat by the stove and held cups of coffee and didn't speak. She could feel the oilcloth package against her ribs through the fabric of her coat. 14 families' worth of evidence. Elias Rourke's careful handwriting. 8 months of her life compressed into a metal box. She thought about the child's boot by the collapsed porch. We'll get them their land back, Ronan said. She looked at him. You were thinking about the homestead, he said. The boot, she said. By the porch. I saw it, he said. She looked at the stove. The fire behind the iron door was visible through the small vents at the bottom, the red-orange pulse of it, steady and consistent. Elias had a list, she said, all 14 families. Names, children's names, where they'd gone after the foreclosure. I memorized it. She paused. I had a lot of time. You memorized 14 families' worth of information from a list you read once, Ronan said. Twice, she said. I'm not perfect. He looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite the thing she expected. Quieter than admiration, more specific. She looked back at the stove. Everett finished the message and handed it to Birch, who folded it and sealed it, and said his fastest rider could leave within the hour and reach Cheyenne by morning. Tell him to go to Dyer directly, Everett said. Not through the sheriff's office, not through any county relay. Directly. Understood, Birch said. He looked at the three of them again with that experienced appraisal. You need a room for tonight. There's a back room, 2 cots, and I can put a bedroll on the floor. That's fine. Lenora said, before Ronan could answer, because she'd already seen him about to offer her both cots, and the whole back room, and sleep in the stable himself. Birch nodded and went to arrange it. Everett sat down at the table and looked like a man whose legs had stopped working temporarily. Dyer will move fast, he said. If the message reaches him by morning and he believes it. He'll believe it, Lenora said. We have the documents. He'll still need to receive them, Everett said, physically, in his hands with our testimony. Then that's what we do, she said. Ronan set his cup down. We can reach Cheyenne in 2 days if the weather holds. 1 hard day's ride if it doesn't, and we push. Creed will know tomorrow that we've contacted Dyer, Everett said, either through someone in his network or because he tracks the way station messages. He'll move. Then we move first, Lenora said. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without flourish, without the performance of confidence. It was just the next sentence in the logic. They were here. The documents were here. Cheyenne was 2 days away, and none of that was going to change by sitting longer at the stove. Ronan was looking at her. What? She said. Nothing, he said. You're doing the thing where you look at me and don't say what you're thinking, she said. She'd noticed it the first week at Iron Pine. He did it 3 or 4 times a day. It had stopped being uncomfortable around day 6 and had become something she was aware of without being sure what to do with. I was thinking, he said, that 3 weeks ago you were chained to a post, and I had no idea who you were. 2 weeks and 4 days, she said. Right. He wrapped his hands around his cup. And now you're the most important person in 3 counties, and you're sitting in a way station master's kitchen, eating the man's bread. She looked at the bread Birch had put out, which she'd been eating steadily without fully tracking it, because she was still in the mode of eating whenever food was present that 8 months of uncertainty had built into her. The bread's good, she said. It is, he agreed. Everett was looking between them with an expression that he quickly rearranged when he realized Lenora had noticed. Get some sleep, she told him. Both of you. I'll take first watch. You don't have to, Ronan started. I know I don't have to, she said. I'm doing it. She settled in the chair beside the door with her coat on and the oilcloth package inside it and her coffee getting cold in her hand. And she listened to the sounds of the way station, settling in the night, Birch moving around in the front room, the horses in the paddock, the wind that had come up from the north again. The same wind that had been moving through the Iron Pine pines 3 days ago. She thought about Bracken, about whether he was eating, about the Strauss boy who'd been trusted to come by. She thought about Bartholomew Creed in his office above the land management building, receiving the news from Gray Coat about what had happened on the road. She thought about the expression on his face, not anger, because he wasn't an angry man. Focus. The cold, patient focus of a man reassessing a situation and calculating the fastest way to close the remaining distance. He would move fast now. She pressed her hand against the oilcloth inside her coat and felt the shape of the documents through the wrapping. Still here, she thought. Still here, Elias. She watched the door and waited for morning. Morning came to the Clover Fork way station gray and cold, with a thin layer of frost on the paddock fence that hadn't been there the night before. Lenora had given up the watch to Ronan at 2 a.m. and slept on one of the back-room cots in the specific, efficient way of someone who has learned to sleep whenever the opportunity exists, regardless of comfort or circumstance. She was up again before Ronan came to wake her, dressed and had water on the stove before Everett emerged from the bedroll on the floor, looking like a man who had conducted several arguments in his sleep and lost most of them. Dyer's man should be getting the message now, Everett said, accepting coffee from Lenora, without comment on the fact that she'd made it. If he moves today, he'll move today, Lenora said. But we can't wait for him to come to us. We go to Cheyenne. Ronan came in from outside, where he'd been checking the horses in the road. No sign of anyone. Either Creed's people pulled back entirely, or they're far enough out we can't see them. Pulled back is worse, Lenora said. Ronan looked at her. Explain that. If they pulled back, it means they've changed strategy. They're not trying to intercept us on the road anymore. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Creed knows we've contacted Dyer. He knows the road approach didn't work. So now he's thinking about what happens when we arrive in Cheyenne, not what happens before. He has people in Cheyenne, Everett said. He has people everywhere, she said. The question is what he's telling them to do. Birch came in from the front room, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a man whose mornings were always early and whose work was always the same, regardless of what his overnight guests were dealing with. He looked at the three of them around his table and said, "Your rider left at midnight." Pushed hard. He paused. Also, someone came by around 3 in the morning asking after travelers. The room went quiet. "What kind of someone?" Ronan said. "Single rider. Said he was looking for a friend who'd come through. Described all three of you well enough that it wasn't a coincidence." Birch poured his own coffee. "I told him I had guests, but privacy rules of the station prevented me from confirming names or descriptions." He sat on the road for about 20 minutes and then rode north. "North," Everett said. "Away from Cheyenne." "Away from Cheyenne," Birch confirmed. "But north also puts you on the high road to Brennan's Crossing, which rejoins the main territorial road about 15 miles outside the city." Lenora looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at the map on the wall. "They're getting ahead of us," he said. "Yes," she said. Birch set down his cup and went to the map himself. He put his finger on a point about midway between Clover Fork and Cheyenne. "Brennan's Crossing is the only realistic place to cut off the main road before the city. After that, the road widens and there's too much traffic for anything quiet." He moved his finger. "But there's a third route. Goes through the Kettner Valley longer by about 8 hours, rougher ground, not a road exactly. More of a cattle drive track. Comes out on the south edge of Cheyenne instead of the north." 8 hours, Lenora said. 8 hours puts us into the city after dark," Ronan said. "Which isn't ideal." 8 hours puts us into the city alive," Lenora said. "Which is more ideal than the alternative." Nobody argued with the math of it. They were saddled, and on the Kettner Valley track, before the frost had fully melted off the fence. The Kettner Valley route was everything Birch had described and several things he hadn't mentioned, possibly because he was a man who defined difficulty by a higher threshold than most. The cattle track wound through broken terrain that required constant attention, creek beds that had to be walked through rather than forded, stretches where the horses had to pick their way over loose rock in single file, a long ascending switchback that gained altitude fast enough that the air thinned noticeably, and both Lenora and Everett felt it in their breathing. Ronan handled the terrain with the economy of a man who has spent 20 years reading land. He didn't explain his choices. He just made them. Here they went left. Here they dropped into the lower drainage. Here they gave the horses 15 minutes on a flat bench of grassland before pushing the ascent again. Lenora followed his lead without the need to ask why. She was thinking about Cheyenne, about Malcolm Dyer, about the specific order in which she would present the documents, which ones established the pattern, which ones demonstrated the mechanism, which ones showed the fraudulent survey alterations. She'd been building this case in her mind for 8 months, and she knew it the way she knew her own handwriting. Every document, every number, every contract clause. Creed's attorney, whoever he brought, would come at her credibility. That was the play. She was a disgraced schoolteacher accused of theft and conspiracy. She was a large woman who had been publicly humiliated and who had reason for personal vendetta. They would try to make the evidence about her feelings rather than about the facts, and the facts were not about her feelings. She had to be precise. Not righteous. Precise. "You're planning the testimony," Ronan said. She blinked. He was riding beside her on a wider section of the track, close enough to speak quietly. "Is it obvious?" she said. "Your mouth does something when you're working through numbers," he said. "The left side. Like you're sorting." She was not particularly pleased to learn her face was legible in this direction. "I'm thinking about what Creed's people will do when we arrive," she said. "Legally. They'll challenge my credibility." "Let them," Ronan said. "Not that simple." "No, but you've been through 8 months of having your credibility challenged, and you're still here with the documents." He paused. "I'd say that's a reasonable demonstration of credibility." "That's not how law works," she said. "I know. I'm just saying you've already proven the relevant thing." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the track ahead, not at her, which made it easier to look at him directly for once. He had a weathered, unassuming quality, the kind of face that didn't announce itself. The kind of face that took time to read. She looked back at the track. "When this is over," she said, "Creed's attorneys are going to come for Iron Pine. They'll find something in your records, some irregularity, some county filing that was done wrong in 1000. 882, and they'll use it. You can try, he said. I'm serious, Ronan. He retaliates against everyone who opposes him. That's his pattern. I know his pattern, Ronan said. You've explained it thoroughly. Then you understand. I understand that if I'd been worried about what Creed might do to my property, I would have kept walking across that market square instead of stopping. He glanced at her briefly. I stopped. She had nothing to say to that. They rode in silence for a while. The valley below them opened up wide and golden-grassed in the afternoon light, with the mountains visible to the west, white at the tops and dark green below the snowline. Margaret liked this country, Ronan said, unexpectedly. He said it the way people say things they've thought privately for a long time and have finally said aloud by accident. Lenora waited. My wife, he said, she'd been east her whole life before we came out here, Philadelphia. She spent the first winter convinced she'd made a terrible mistake. He kept his eyes on the valley. By the second spring, she said she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. When did she die? Lenora asked. She said it simply, without the cautious softening people usually apply to the question. 3 years ago, he said, February, fever, a pause, fast, which people tell you is better. I'm not sure they're right about that. I don't think they're right about that either, Lenora said. He looked at her. My father, she said, 6 years ago. People said the same thing. He nodded. They didn't say anything else about it. But something in the air between them shifted the slight specific shift that happens when two people who have been careful with each other realize they have been careful about the same things. Everett, riding behind them, had the good sense to look at the scenery. They came down out of the Kettner Valley in the last hour of light and hit the south approach to Cheyenne, just as the city's lamps were beginning to come on dots of yellow in the gray dusk, scattered across the flat ground like a reflection of the stars starting to appear above. Cheyenne was larger than Red Hollow by a factor that made Red Hollow feel like a sketch of a town. The streets near the south entrance were busy even at dusk. Wagons, horses, foot traffic, the noise of commerce and argument, and the particular urban restlessness of a territorial capital where people came because something was happening or because they needed something to happen. Lenora had not been to Cheyenne in 4 years. She'd forgotten how much sound there was. Everett guided them through the main commercial streets toward the government quarter, moving with the confidence of a man who had been here before on official business and knew how to look like he belonged. The Territorial Attorney's Office was on Harrison Avenue, a 2-story brick building with lit windows on the upper floor that suggested people working late. A man Lenora didn't recognize was standing outside the building's entrance. He was lean, about 45, with the compact alertness of someone who has been waiting and is experienced enough to make waiting look like standing. When he saw Everett, something in his posture changed a slight forward shift, a sharpening. Sloan, he said. Mr. Dyer, Everett said. Malcolm Dyer looked at Ronan. Looked at Lenora. His eyes went to the shape of the oilcloth package, visible now that she'd moved her coat aside in the warmth of riding. Come inside, he said. The office was warm and overlit and stacked with documents in a way that suggested a man who worked fast and filed slowly. Dyer moved 2 stacks of paper off chairs without apology and gestured for them to sit. He remained standing himself, behind his desk, looking at Lenora. You're Vance, he said. Yes, she said. Elias Rourke brought you survey data last year. In August. Yes. You have copies of the contracts. 14, she said. Originals of Rourke's survey notes. My handwritten copies of the contracts, I copied them in the original language, not summarized. Every clause. Dyer's expression was the particular focused blankness of a man whose mind is moving fast behind a still face. The legislative land review is in 11 days, he said. Creed has 3 properties scheduled for final determination. I know, she said. That's why he moved when he did. If I file an emergency petition to suspend the review proceedings and attach this evidence, the review board will have to halt until a full investigation is complete. He paused. But the petition has to be airtight. The review board chair is Harlan Price, and Price is not in Creed's pocket, but he's also not going to disrupt a scheduled legislative process on the basis of a woman who was publicly charged with theft and conspiracy. Then he'll look at the documents, Lenora said. Not at me. He'll look at both, Dyer said. Then he'll look at the documents first, she said, And when he's looked at those, what he thinks about me won't matter. Dyer looked at her for a long moment. Show me, he said. She opened the oilcloth package on his desk. She did not hand him the documents in a pile. She laid them out in sequence, the order she had planned during the hours of writing, the logical progression that built the case from foundation to conclusion. The original survey notes first, in Elias Rourke's hand, showing the actual property boundaries. Then the county's recorded boundaries, smaller by measurable amounts, in every case. Then the contracts, with the hidden clauses marked. Then her own handwritten summary, cross-referencing the survey discrepancies against the foreclosure records, showing exactly how much additional land Creed had taken beyond what the contracts justified. She walked Dyer through it without notes, every number from memory, every contract clause in its original language. Dyer didn't interrupt. He read what she laid down, looked at what she pointed to, asked 3 questions, each precise, each aimed at the places where the evidence chain required confirmation rather than inference. She answered all 3 without hesitation. When she finished, he stood behind his desk and looked at the spread of documents for a long moment. These are real, he said, not a question. Yes, she said. And you memorized all of this? I had 8 months, she said. He looked at Everett. You're prepared to testify to your observations at the hearing? Yes, Everett said, including my own failure to raise objections. That's going to be uncomfortable for you. I know. Dyer pulled a sheet of paper from the right side of his desk, the clean side, which suggested it was kept clear for immediate work. He picked up his pen. I'll file the emergency petition tonight. We can get it before Price at first light. He looked at Lenora. I'll need you to provide sworn testimony to the petition content. Tonight, before I file. All right, she said. There's one more thing, Dyer said. His voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more deliberate. Creed has already made contact with this office. This afternoon, before your message arrived. He paused. He filed a complaint with the territorial governor's office, alleging that a fugitive witness, you, Miss Vance, has unlawfully taken county property, meaning the documents, and that a deputy marshal, meaning Sloan, has aided in the removal. He's requesting your arrest and the return of the documents to county custody. The room was very quiet. Lenora felt Ronan go still beside her. She felt her own heartbeat do something complicated in her chest. He was already here, she said. He had a 3-hour head start on you, Dyer said. He took the main road. So he knew we'd gone around, Ronan said. He suspected, Dyer said. He filed preemptively. Which means he doesn't know for certain you have the documents, yet he's filing on the assumption that you do, hoping to establish legal grounds to recover them before you reach me. He looked at Lenora steadily. The good news is that the governor's office referred the complaint back to my office for review before acting on it, because it falls under territorial legal jurisdiction. The less good news is that I have approximately until morning before the governor's office expects a response, at which point, if I haven't responded, they'll likely issue a provisional hold. A provisional hold, Everett said, on us. On the documents, Dyer said. And technically on Miss Vance. As a material witness in Creed's complaint, he set down his pen. Which is why I need the sworn testimony drafted, signed, and attached to my emergency petition before I walk it to Price's house tonight. Because once it's in Price's hands as part of an active petition, the governor's office can't touch it without going through the review board. And the review board operates on a different timeline than a provisional hold. Lenora understood. We have tonight, she said. We have tonight, Dyer confirmed. She looked at Ronan. He looked back at her with the steady expression that she'd come to understand meant he was already in, not deciding, not calculating, just in. Then, let's start, she said. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that doesn't look like much from the outside 2 people at a desk, documents spread between them, a lamp burning, a pen moving across paper. But Lenora had been building toward this for 8 months, and she came to it with the precision of someone who has rehearsed a thing so many times in their mind that the actual performance of it is almost a relief. Dyer was methodical and fast. He drafted. She reviewed. She corrected. He redrafted. He asked questions the way a prosecutor prepares, not looking for the answer he wanted, but looking for the weakness an opposing attorney would find and eliminating it before it could be found. Twice he pushed back on her phrasing. Say it plainly, he told her, when she'd written that Creed's contract modifications appeared to alter the agreed terms. Creed's contract modifications altered the agreed terms. She rewrote. Better, he said. You're not afraid to be direct, she said. I'm afraid of Creed winning, he said. That cures most other fears. Ronan sat on the far side of the office with his coffee dyer's assistant. A quiet young man named Hewitt had produced a pot without being asked and watched the door. Not obviously. He was reading a territorial gazette that had been on the side table, or appearing to read it. But Lenora noticed that he turned the pages at exactly the intervals that a man watching a door would turn them if he were trying to look occupied. She noticed. She said nothing about it. Everett was in the adjoining room with Hewitt, giving his own account of the hearing to be included as a separate sworn statement. She could hear his voice through the wall low, and even the voice of a man working through something difficult with his eyes open. At midnight, Dyer read back the completed petition aloud, while Lenora followed along with the documents. Every citation was correct. Every contract clause was properly attributed. The survey discrepancies were listed by property, by measurement, by the margin between what was recorded and what Rourke had actually measured in the field. Sign here, Dyer said. She signed her full name, Lenora Ann Vance, in the clearest hand she'd produced in months. The pen felt steady. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere around hour 2. Everett came in and signed his statement. Ronan witnessed both signatures. Dyer gathered the packet petition, sworn statements, original documents, and certified copies he'd made with Hewitt's help and put on his coat. I'll walk this to Price's residence now, he said. He lives 4 blocks from here. He'll be unhappy about the hour. Will he act on it? Lenora asked. Price is unhappy about corruption, Dyer said. He'll be less unhappy about the hour than about what's in these documents. He picked up the packet. Hewitt will stay with you. Don't leave the building. He went out. The room felt different without his presence, slightly deflated, the focused energy of the last 4 hours dissipating into the quieter energy of waiting. Lenora leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Ronan put down the Gazette and came and sat across from her in the chair Dyer had vacated. You did it, he said. We did it, she said. Past tense is premature. Documents are in Dyer's hands, he said. That part is done. She thought about that. He was right. Whatever happened next, that part was done. The documents that she had hidden and guarded and carried through an ambush on the territorial road and across the Kettner Valley, in fading light they were in the right hands now, on their way to the right person, and no provisional hold and no complaint to the governor's office was going to undo that. Something in her chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time loosened by a small amount. She pressed her hand flat on the desk and felt the solid surface of it. Elias would have done it better, she said. He was a better technical writer than I am, more precise with the survey language. He did his part, Ronan said. You did yours. He died, she said. He died doing his part, Ronan said. That's not nothing. She looked at him directly. No, she said. It's not nothing. Price acted before sunrise. Dyer returned to the office at 3 a.m. with the look of a man who had been through a difficult conversation and come out the other side of it intact. Price had read the petition. Price had read the documents, all of them. Dyer said, including the survey notes, which he'd apparently studied for 20 minutes in his study while Dyer stood and waited. Price had asked 4 questions, all of them aimed at the methodology of the survey comparisons, which suggested he understood exactly what he was looking at. Price had signed the suspension order. The review is halted pending full investigation, Dyer said. Territorial marshals will execute warrants for Creed's land records by morning. He sat down in his chair, and the governor's office has been notified that the documents they were asked to have recovered are now material evidence in an active territorial investigation and cannot be returned to county custody. Lenora let out a breath. That's not the end of it, Everett said. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Creed will fight. He has attorneys, he has money, he has every official he's compromised over 15 years. Yes, Dyer said, it's not the end, but it's the end of the beginning. He looked at Lenora. You'll need to remain in Cheyenne and be available for further testimony as the investigation proceeds. Weeks, possibly months, I understand, she said. Creed will attempt to discredit you through every channel available, he said. His attorneys will file motions. They'll subpoena your background. They'll bring up the original charges against you. Let them, she said. He studied her. You're not worried. I'm worried about the right things, she said. The charges against me were built on a fraudulent hearing, false testimony, and forged evidence. In a real proceeding with actual rules of evidence, I'm not concerned. She paused. What I'm concerned about is the 14 families, the timeline for returning their properties, whether there's a mechanism for compensating what they've lost during the years of Creed's ownership. Dyer looked at her with the specific expression of a lawyer who has just encountered a layperson thinking like a lawyer. There are mechanisms, he said carefully. We'd need to pursue them as secondary proceedings after the criminal case is established. How secondary? Months, possibly longer. She looked at the desk. Some of those families have been displaced for 3 years. Some longer. I know, he said. He said it with genuine weight, not the performative sympathy of a man managing a witness, but the actual recognition of what the numbers represented. Then we move as fast as the law allows, she said. And when it doesn't allow fast enough, we find every legal mechanism to make it faster. Dyer almost smiled. It was a small thing contained, but it was there. Get some sleep, he said. Hewitt will show you the rooms upstairs. Tomorrow there will be marshals to brief and motions to respond to, and approximately a week's worth of work to do before breakfast. He turned back to his desk. Lenora stood and looked at Ronan. He was already looking at her, had been, she thought, for most of the last hour. The same quiet attention she'd been aware of since the first morning at Iron Pine, the same steady quality that didn't demand anything and wasn't asking to. You should get back to the ranch, she said. I should, he agreed, not moving. Bracken will be confused, she said. He'll manage, Ronan said. She looked at him for a moment. I don't know how long this takes, she said. The testimony, the proceedings, it could be months. Yes, he said. Iron Pine, we'll be there, he said. She looked at the window where the first edge of dawn was beginning to separate the sky from the roof lines of Cheyenne. Then she looked back at him. The accounts ledger I reorganized, she said. The spring planting schedule is on the 3rd page. The notation on the water rights easement for the south pasture is on page 7. I flagged an irregularity you should address before summer. Page 7, he said, noted. And Casper needs the east paddock rotated in 3 weeks or the grass won't recover by fall. I know how to manage horses, he said mildly. I know you do, she said. I know what you're doing, he said. He said it gently. The way you say something to a person you've figured out without making them feel figured out. You're tying everything down before you let yourself stop moving. Same thing you did the night before we left. She was quiet. It's all right, he said. I do it too. She looked at him again, really looked, the direct way she rarely permitted herself, because looking at someone directly was giving them something, and she'd spent a long time being careful about what she gave. Thank you, she said, for the square, and everything after. You already thanked me, he said. I know, I'm saying it again. He nodded once, in the way that accepts something without making it larger than it needs to be. Outside, Cheyenne was beginning to wake up wheels on cobblestone. A distant shout, a rooster somewhere on the south edge of the commercial district, performing its daily, irrelevant optimism. The lamp on Dyer's desk had burned low enough that the dawn coming through the window was doing more work than the oil. Lenora picked up her coat from the back of the chair. Inside the lining, where she'd kept the oilcloth package for 3 days, there was nothing now but warmth. She put the coat on and felt the difference. It was not a bad feeling. It was the particular feeling of a thing delivered the lightness that comes not from loss but from completion. She had carried it as far as it needed to go. Now other hands would carry it the rest of the way. She walked out of the room and went upstairs to sleep. Ronan rode back to Iron Pine alone. The road south from Cheyenne took most of a day, and he spent it the way he spent most long rides, not thinking about any one thing for too long, letting his mind move through things the way water moves through a field, finding the low places and settling there briefly before moving on. He thought about Price signing the suspension order in his study at 3 in the morning. He thought about Dyer's face when Lenora had finished laying out the documents, that specific expression of a man who has just seen something he suspected was true become something he could prove. He thought about Everett Sloane, who had ridden back toward Red Hollow that same morning, wearing the particular look of a man walking toward something difficult that he'd already decided to stop avoiding. Mostly, he thought about a woman standing in his kitchen at midnight, surrounded by other people's paperwork, building a case from memory in the lamplight. He got back to Iron Pine as the sun was getting low and found the Strauss boy in the yard with a bucket, looking relieved to see him. Bracken came out of the barn at a run and stopped just short of the horse, tail moving in the violent, full-body way of a dog that has strong feelings about reunions, but is maintaining what dignity he can. "He eat?" Ronan asked the boy. "Every meal," the boy said. He also reorganized the barn. Ronan looked at the barn. The tools that had been piled loosely near the entrance were pushed to one side in a rough pile. A feed sack had been dragged off its shelf. 2 horse blankets had been relocated to the floor. "Right," Ronan said. He paid the Strauss boy and unsaddled the horse and stood in the quiet yard in the last of the light. The pines were moving. The east fence that Lenora had repaired was straight and clean against the darkening sky. The garden along the side of the house had the orderly, purposeful look of something that had been planned and would produce results. The house felt very empty when he went in. He'd been alone in it for 3 years before she arrived and had never noticed the emptiness as a specific quality. It had just been what the house was. Now it had the feeling of a space that knows it's been altered and hasn't adjusted back. He made supper without particular attention to it, fed Bracken, sat at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger Lenora had reorganized and turned to page 7. She'd flagged the water rights easement irregularity with a small precise mark in the margin, not his handwriting, not a system he'd used, but immediately legible. Below it, in the same neat hand, 3 lines of notation explaining what she'd found and what needed to be filed with the county to resolve it. He sat with the ledger for a while. Then he got up and went to bed and slept better than he had in weeks, which surprised him, and in the morning he began the work of keeping the ranch running in the extended absence of someone who had apparently become, without either of them planning it, essential to how it functioned. The proceedings in Cheyenne took 11 weeks. Not the months Dyer had warned about, though there were moments when it stretched toward that horizon and Lenora had to recalibrate her patience the same way you recalibrate to cold, not by fighting it, but by adjusting what you wear and how you move. The first week was marshals and depositions. Territorial officers arrived in Red Hollow with warrants for Creed's land records and the specific, methodical energy of people who have been given a clear task and sufficient authority to complete it. Creed's attorneys filed 3 motions in the first 4 days, one challenging the legitimacy of the suspension order, one challenging the chain of custody of the documents, one challenging Lenora's standing as a material witness given her prior criminal accusation. Dyer defeated all 3. The chain of custody motion was the most aggressive. Creed's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man from Denver named Aldous Price, argued that the documents had been removed from county jurisdiction without proper authorization and were therefore inadmissible. Dyer responded by demonstrating that the documents had never been county property in the first place. Elias Rourke's survey notes were the personal professional records of a private contractor, and Lenora's handwritten copies were her own work product. The only county documents in the packet were the official land records she'd cross-referenced against, and those had been obtained through legitimate public access before her arrest. Price pushed. Dyer pushed back harder. Lenora sat through the preliminary hearings in a chair against the wall of Price's review chambers and watched Dyer work and occasionally passed him a folded note with a reference number or a contract clause she thought he was about to need. He took every note without looking at her and used everyone. After the 3rd day, he told her she should have been a lawyer. "I should have been left alone to teach school," she said. He thought about that. "Yes," he said, "you should have." The criminal investigation into Creed moved on a parallel track territorial marshals, not county officials, which was a distinction that mattered because it removed the process from the jurisdiction of every court official Creed had spent 15 years compromising. Witnesses began coming forward within the first week. Not the powerful ones, not the people who had participated actively, but the peripheral ones. Clerks who had processed paperwork they knew was wrong. An assessor's assistant who had been told to record measurements he hadn't taken. A notary who had witnessed signatures at times he could now demonstrate didn't match the dates on the documents. Small people who had done small wrong things and had been living with the specific weight of that for years. Lenora did not go easy on any of them when Dyer asked her to review their accounts for consistency. She caught two discrepancies that would have undermined the prosecution's timeline and told Dyer about both of them without softening it. "You're harder on the cooperating witnesses than you are on Creed's people," he observed. "Creed's people are the enemy," she said. "The cooperating witnesses are the foundation. A foundation with cracks is worse than no foundation." He fixed both discrepancies. Everett Sloan testified in the third week. He came to Cheyenne on his own, without being summoned, arrived at Dyer's office on a Tuesday morning and said he was ready. He testified for 2 full days. His account of the original hearing was precise and complete and self-incriminating in the specific way of a man who has decided that the full truth is the only version worth telling. He did not minimize his failure. He did not present himself as a victim of Creed's manipulation, though he could have made that case. He said clearly, on the record, that he had seen evidence of fraud and had chosen silence, and that the choice had been his. Price cross-examined him for 3 hours, trying to find the version of the story where Everett was the real problem, and Creed was simply a man who'd been misserved by a corrupt local official. Everett didn't give it to him. When it was over, Lenora told him it was enough. He looked at her with the careful expression he always had when she said anything that resembled an assessment of his character. "It's not absolution," she said. "I told you I wasn't going to hand that out." "I know," he said. "But it's enough," she said. "What you did in that room for 2 days, that's the work. That's what I told you I needed." He nodded. He looked slightly less like a man carrying something heavier than his frame was built for. "What happens to your badge?" she asked. "Voluntary suspension pending review," he said. "Territorial Marshal's office will decide. Probably a formal reprimand, possibly removal." He paused. "I think I'm all right with either. Are you?" He thought about it honestly. "I think I was better at the job before I stopped doing it right," he said. "If they give me the badge back, I'll know what it costs. If they don't, I'll find something else that costs the same and do that." She looked at him. "That's not nothing either," she said. He almost smiled. "You and Mercer," he said. "You both talk like that." "Like what? Like everything is a ledger entry. Credit, debit," he paused. "It's oddly comforting." She did smile then. A real one, not the quick almost that she'd been managing for weeks. It surprised her slightly, the way real smiles sometimes do when you've been economical with them for too long. Bartholomew Creed was arrested on a Friday. Not dramatically. That was the thing about the actual moment. It had none of the quality of the scenes that had led to it. There were no crowds, no public display. 2 territorial marshals went to Creed's office above the land management building on a Friday afternoon and served him with an arrest warrant for fraud, conspiracy to defraud, falsification of land records, and the murder of Elias Rourke. They walked him down the stairs and into a waiting transport. Lenora heard about it from Dyer, who told her with the same measured tone he used for everything. She sat with the information for a moment. "How did he look?" she asked. Dyer considered the question. "Smaller," he said, "than I expected." She understood that. Power has a physical quality when it's operating. It takes up space, it fills a room, it makes the person at its center seem larger than their actual dimensions. When it's gone, the person is just a person, just a man in his 60s being walked down a staircase by 2 men with badges. She'd spent 8 months being afraid of someone who turned out to be just a man whose power had depended entirely on nobody pushing back. She thought about that for a while after Dyer left the room. The trial itself began 6 weeks later and lasted 9 days. Lenora testified on days 3 and 4. Price came at her exactly the way she'd anticipated her credibility, her weight, her prior accusation, her personal relationship with Ronan Mercer, her emotional investment in the outcome. He was skilled. He knew how to build a picture of a woman driven by grudge and humiliation rather than by facts. She let him build it. And then she dismantled it clause by clause, contract by contract, survey measurement by survey measurement, with the specific patience of someone who has had 8 months to prepare and a memory that doesn't lose things. She didn't get angry on the stand. She'd decided that before she walked in. Anger would confirm Price's narrative. Precision would destroy it. Every time he tried to redirect her toward her feelings about the situation, she redirected back to the numbers. Every time he suggested she had interpreted rather than recorded, she quoted the exact language of the original contract clause. At one point, Price asked her directly whether she believed Bartholomew Creed was an evil man. "I believe," she said, "that the contracts entered into evidence as Exhibits 7 through 21 contain fraudulent alterations to agreed terms, and that the survey records entered as Exhibits 1 through 6 demonstrate deliberate misrecording of property boundaries. Whether Mr. Creed is evil is a question for a philosopher. Whether he committed fraud is a question for this jury, and I believe the documents answer it." The jury took 4 hours, guilty on all counts. Lenora was in the corridor outside the courtroom when the verdict was announced. She heard it through the door, the specific quality of sound that a room full of people makes when something long anticipated has finally occurred. She stood in the corridor and felt the walls solid behind her and breathed. She had not gone in for the verdict. She had been in there for 9 days. She had done her part. The moment of the verdict itself felt like it belonged to the 14 families, to Elias Rourke's sister in Laramie, who had made the journey to Cheyenne, to the small people who had testified at cost to themselves. It didn't feel like hers to claim. The door opened and Dyer came out. He looked at her. "Guilty," he said. "I heard," she said. He extended his hand. She shook it. "The sentencing will determine his prison term," he said. "Given the scope, the fraud, the conspiracy, the murder, the territorial code allows for significant time." He paused. "Elias Rourke's murder is the count that matters most. That alone carries a mandatory minimum." "Good," she said. She looked down at the floor for a moment. "The property restoration proceedings," she said. "When do those begin?" "I've already filed the initial motion," he said. "Some of the families may have their cases resolved within the year. Others will take longer depending on what Creed's holding company has done with the land in the interim." He paused. "There will also be civil proceedings available to the families for compensation claims against the estate. I'll help with documentation for any family that needs it," she said. "I have all 14 contracts memorized." He looked at her with the same expression he'd had in his office that first night, the lawyer's recognition of a particular kind of useful mind. "I know," he said. "I'm counting on it." She came back to Red Hollow on a Thursday in early autumn. The aspens along the northern road had turned the particular yellow that aspens go, almost luminous, the kind of color that makes the light feel thick. She rode in on a horse Dyer's office had arranged, with a bag that was heavier leaving Cheyenne than it had been arriving, because she'd accumulated things during 11 weeks in a city books. A second dress, a sheaf of legal documents she intended to study. She didn't go into town first. She went to Iron Pine. The ranch looked the same from the road, the pines, the house, the east fence she'd repaired still straight and solid. The garden had been maintained. She could see not with her particular system, but maintained. Some of the beds had been turned already for the season. She was still 50 yards from the house when Bracken came out of nowhere at a dead run, no dignity whatsoever, and hit her leg at full momentum and nearly knocked her sideways off the horse. She grabbed mane and laughed, actually laughed, out loud, the kind that surprises you, and got down from the horse and crouched and let him be ridiculous about it for a full minute. Ronan came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the table, the first morning at Iron Pine steady, taking stock, not performing anything. "The verdict," he said. "Guilty," she said. "All counts." He nodded once. "Good." She stood up from Bracken and looked at the house and the pines and the east fence and the garden. "Page 7, she said. "The water rights easement. Did you file it?" "Filed 3 weeks ago," he said. "County confirmed receipt." "Good," she said. He came across the yard and took the horse's reins from her. "East paddock rotation," he said. "I moved Casper's herd 2 weeks ago." "I saw," she said. "The grass looks right." They stood for a moment in the particular way they had developed, comfortable with the pauses between things, not needing to fill them. "There are more proceedings," she told him. "Property restoration cases for the families. Dyer needs documentation support. It's work I can do from here, mostly. Some travel to Cheyenne for hearings." "All right," he said. "It'll take a year," she said. "Maybe more." "All right," he said again. She looked at him. "You keep saying that. It keeps being true," he said. She almost said something, and then didn't. She looked at the pines instead, moving in the thin autumn wind. A year ago, not even a year, 8 months ago, she had been chained to a post in a market square with a painted board around her neck, while a crowd decided what her life was worth. She had stood there and kept her eyes on the middle distance and given her last bread to a starving dog and decided that she was not going to cooperate with anyone's judgment of her. That had been the right decision. Not because it had led here, not because here was the reward for her stubbornness. Life didn't work that way, and she was too practical to believe otherwise. She might have held her position and still lost. She might have been right about everything and still ended up with nothing. Being right about a thing didn't guarantee the outcome. It just meant you had been right. But she had been right, and she had been stubborn. And she had found, improbably and without planning it, a man who read the right detail in the middle of a crowd. That was enough of a story for one life. "I need to go to town tomorrow," she said. "The schoolhouse. I heard they reopened it." Ronan looked at her sideways. "Commissioners' Council voted 3 weeks ago. They're looking for a teacher." "Are they?" she said. "Town's changed some," he said, "after everything that came out about Creed and the properties. People are, I don't know, quieter, more careful about what they say out loud." "Quieter isn't always better," she said. "No," he agreed. "But in this case, it's probably an improvement over what they were saying before." She thought about the schoolhouse, about the particular work of teaching not just the facts and the numbers, but the slow, unglamorous labor of showing children how to think. How to ask a question before they accept an answer. How to look at a document and find the thing that doesn't match. How to be in a room full of people who are all wrong about the same thing and not simply agree with them. "They'll know who I am," she said. "The children will have heard things. They'll hear the real version now," Ronan said. "That doesn't erase what they already heard." "No," he said, "but you can decide what you do with that." He paused. "The same way you decided what to do with 8 months in a cell and a painted sign and an entire town's opinion of you." She looked at him. "You stayed standing," he said. "You can stand in a classroom." She thought about that. She thought about the first day she'd walked into the Red Hollow schoolhouse 3 years ago, the smell of chalk dust and the uneven floorboards and the 24 faces looking at her with the frank, unfiltered assessment that children apply to new things. She had been a large woman with a direct way of speaking and zero patience for condescension in either direction. And by the second week 3, parents had complained about her approach, and by the 3rd month, those same parents had stopped complaining because their children had started coming home and asking questions they couldn't answer. She had been a good teacher. She was still a good teacher. The school's opinion of her, the town's opinion, none of it changed what she knew how to do or how to do it. "I'm going to town tomorrow," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was just the next thing. "I'll drive you in," Ronan said. "I can ride," she said. "I know you can ride," he said. "I'll drive you in." She studied him. He looked back at her with the same undramatic steadiness that had defined him since the first moment in the square, not performing, not announcing himself, just present and decided. "All right," she said. They went inside. The kitchen looked the same and smelled like wood smoke and the particular combination of coffee and horse that Iron Pine always had. Her ledger was on the table where she'd left it. The lamp was in the same place. Bracken went directly to his spot beside the stove and turned 3 times and settled. She sat at the table and opened the ledger to a clean page. Ronan put the kettle on. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. He turned from the stove. "While I was in Cheyenne," she said. She looked at the clean page in the ledger. "I had a lot of time to think. Which I've been doing for 8 months already, but this was different, time after, not time during. And I realized I'd been keeping a specific kind of distance." She paused. "From you, deliberately." He waited. "Not because of anything wrong," she said. "Because of something right. Because I didn't want to mistake one thing for another. Gratitude for something else. Depending on someone who helped me for—" She stopped. Started differently. "I've spent my whole life being told that a woman who looks like me should be grateful for whatever she gets. That wanting more, expecting something real, is unreasonable." She looked up at him. "I'm not grateful," she said. "I mean, I am. But not the way people wanted me to be, the way that makes you smaller and quieter and careful not to want too much." She set the pencil down on the ledger. "I'm here because I want to be here. Because this is where I choose to be. That's different. Ronan came to the table and sat across from her. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was being precise rather than quick. I know the difference, he said. I knew it when you told me the first time. Then I'm telling you again, she said, clearly, without the version where I'm still managing what I let myself want. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, the same table, the same lamp, the same two cups that had held their first conversation in the dark before dawn. I want you here, he said, not the version that's easier to understand, not a quieter version, or a smaller version. He paused. Just you. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she put her hand over his on the table, not dramatically, not as a conclusion to anything. Just the weight of one hand on another in a warm kitchen at the end of a very long road. Outside, the aspens were moving in the wind, and the pines were dark against the evening sky, and Red Hollow sat in its valley 10 miles north, changed and still changing. Punishment Post gone from the market square, and the schoolhouse lit from within, and 14 families, somewhere in the territory, beginning the slow work of getting back what had been taken from them. It was not a neat ending. The property cases would take years. Some families would never recover what they'd lost in the years of displacement. The time, the children's schooling, the seasons of crops that hadn't been planted. Everett Sloan would receive his formal reprimand and his badge back, and he would spend the next decade trying to be the kind of officer he should have been from the start, succeeding more often than he failed. Dyer would file 47 legal motions related to Creed's case over the following 2 years and win 39 of them. Creed would die in a territorial prison at the age of 64 5 years into his sentence, of the accumulated weight of having been a certain kind of man for a very long time. Nobody in Red Hollow wept. Lenora began teaching at the schoolhouse on the first Monday of October. She walked in with the chalk dust and the uneven floorboards and 21 faces, and one question she asked us on the first day and every first day after, not what do you want to be, but what do you notice that other people walk past? She kept the painted sign thief, liar. Take her, if you want her locked in the supply cabinet at the back of the schoolroom. She showed it to children when they needed to see it. Not often. But when a child believed the loudest judgment in the room was the true one, she took it out and held it up, and told them about the distance between what people write about you and what you actually are. The distance, she told them, is yours. It belongs to you. Nobody else can close it. She had stood in a market square in the summer heat with that sign around her neck, and she had kept her eyes on the middle distance, and she had given her last bread to a starving dog, and she had decided to stay standing. And a man across the square had noticed the right detail. Told the children this because she believed it was the most important thing she knew, that the truth of a person is not in what the loudest voice says about them. It is in what they do when no one is watching and there is nothing to be gained. It is in the small choices that nobody sees and nobody records. Those choices are the ones that hold. She was not a perfect woman. She was sharp sometimes when patient would have served better. She held distances she didn't always need to hold. She had spent so long protecting herself from other people's judgments that lowering that protection, even to someone who had earned it, still required a decision each time. She made the decision each time. That was the work. Not the trial, not the documents, not the 11 weeks in Cheyenne. Those had been the crisis. The work was the daily thing, showing up to the classroom, sitting at the kitchen table, choosing to put her hand over someone else's hand in the lamplight and mean it without reservation. The work was the choosing, and Lenora Vance, who had been chained in a market square and called worthless and survived it and come out the other side, not grateful in the small way but powerful in the true way, did the work. Every day. She did the work. The winter that followed was the hardest Red Hollow had seen in a decade. Snow came in November and stayed, piling against the fence posts and the barn walls and the base of the pine trees in drifts that reached Ronan's knee by December. The road into town became impassable for stretches of 2 and 3 days at a time, and on those days Iron Pine existed as its own complete world, the smoke from the stove, the horses in the barn. Bracken pressed against the door with the philosophical patience of a dog who has decided that weather is a personal insult, but not worth fighting about. Lenora taught on the days the road was open, and used the closed days to prepare the lessons she'd teach when it opened again. She spread papers across the kitchen table and worked by lamp in the mornings while Ronan did the barn chores. And when he came back in smelling of cold air and horses, she had coffee ready without planning to it, had just become the shape of the morning. She noticed this without commenting on it. She noticed a lot of things that had become the shape of something without being decided. The way Ronan had moved her books from the spare room to the main room shelf without asking, because she'd been going back and forth between rooms to reference them, and it was inefficient. The way she'd taken over the account filing without discussing it, because his system had a structural problem that bothered her every time she looked at it. The way they'd stopped saying good night as a formal thing, and it had become simply an understanding. A lamp turned down. A door left open so Bracken could move between rooms freely. These were not grand gestures. They were the small, unremarkable adjustments that people make when they have stopped imagining a future without someone in it. Lenora thought about this on a Tuesday in January, when the snow had kept her home for the third day running, and she was sitting by the window with a property restoration brief. She was helping Dyer prepare for one of the 14 families. Outside, the world was entirely white, and the pines were loaded heavy and still. She thought, this is what I chose. Not in the way of congratulating herself, just in the way of verifying the same precision she applied to contracts and survey records, applied now to her own life. Yes, this chosen. It was a good feeling, quieter than she'd expected happiness to feel, and more solid. The first property was returned in February. The Halbert family, the same abandoned homestead, where Lenora had hidden the documents beneath the flat creek stone, received official notification from the territorial court that their land title was restored. The holding company Creed had used to manage foreclosed properties was being dissolved, its assets returned through the court's restitution mechanism, and the Halbert claim was the first to clear because it had the cleanest documentation. Dyer sent Lenora the notification by courier. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in the top drawer of the kitchen chest. That evening, she told Ronan. He was at the stove, managing something that smelled like it was going to be stew, and he listened and turned around with the spoon still in his hand and looked at her. First one, he said. First one, she said. 12 more pending. Some will take longer. But first one, he said. Yes, she said. First one. He turned back to the stove. She sat at the table and looked at the drawer where she'd put the notification and thought about the child's boot by the collapsed porch step of the Halbert homestead. Brown leather, worn at the toe. A family had left it when they'd been forced out with whatever they could carry, and it had stayed behind in the grass small, abandoned, concrete evidence of what displacement actually looks like when you get close enough. She thought about the family coming back to that land, what the first morning would look like, whether the porch had collapsed further in the months since they'd left, or whether it had held. She was going to make sure every remaining case moved as fast as the law allowed. She had already told Dyer this. He had told her he believed her. She hadn't needed him to. Spring came back to Red Hollow, the way it always did in that part of Wyoming, not gently, but suddenly, overnight almost. Snow retreating to the high ground, and the valley floor going green within a week in a way that always felt slightly miraculous, even when you knew the science of it. Lenora's classroom windows faced east, and in the mornings the light came through them at an angle that made the chalk dust in the air look like slow gold. She had 23 students by April 3, more than when she'd started, because 2 families had moved back to Red Hollow following the Creed verdict and the announcement of the property restoration proceedings. People who had left because things had gotten bad were beginning to calculate whether things might be getting better. Some of them came to her classroom and apologized. Not many, but some. A woman named Clara Hedges, whose husband had been one of the men who'd laughed loudest in the market square, came to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon after the children had gone home and stood in the doorway with her hands clasped in front of her and said she was sorry for what her husband had said and for not saying anything against it herself. Lenora looked at her for a moment. "Your daughter is doing well with her reading," she said. "She's ahead of where she should be for her age. You should know that." Clara Hedges blinked. "Ah, yes, thank you. That's what I want from you," Lenora said. "Not the apology. Make sure she stays in school." Clara Hedges nodded, twice quickly, and left. Lenora turned back to the board she'd been erasing and finished erasing it. She was not interested in performing forgiveness for people who needed her to perform it. She was interested in the children, in whether they had enough light in the classroom on gray days, which they didn't, which she'd raised with the town council twice, in whether the Martinez boys' difficulty with letters was what she thought it was, and what could be done about it, in whether the Strauss girl, the same Strauss family whose boy had watched Bracken through the winter, was going to be able to pursue the mathematical education she was clearly capable of, or whether her family's expectations would close that door before it fully opened. These were the problems she had energy for. The rest she left where it belonged in the past, in the court record, in the 11 weeks of testimony and countermotion, and the specific, grinding work of making a thing right through official channels. She had done that work. Now she was doing this work. In March, a letter arrived from Elias Rourke's sister. Her name was Catherine, and she wrote from Laramie in a hand that was clearly her brother's hand, reflected the Simprasensis letter formation, the same tendency to press harder on the downstroke. She had been at the trial. She had sat in the gallery on the day Lenora testified and had watched and not introduced herself, which she apologized for in the letter. She said she hadn't known what to say and hadn't wanted to interrupt something that was clearly functioning as it needed to function. She said Elias had mentioned Lenora in his last letter to her, had said he'd found someone who understood what the numbers meant and wasn't afraid of what they implied. He'd said he thought it was going to be all right. Lenora read the letter at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with her coffee getting cold beside her. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the pines for a while. She wrote back that same day. She told Catherine about the afternoon she and Elias had spent comparing the survey records against the contracts, the 4 hours, the lamp burning low, the moment when the pattern became undeniable, and they'd both gone quiet with the weight of what they were looking at. She told her that her brother had been precise and careful, and that precision had mattered enormously, and that the court record now reflected the full truth of what he'd found, and that his name was on it. She told her that a proper grave marker had been placed at Boundary Creek, which was true. Dyer had arranged it as part of the court's formal acknowledgement of Elias Rourke's role in uncovering the fraud. She told her that it was, in the end, all right, that he'd been right about that. She sealed the letter and gave it to Ronan to post the next time he went into town. He read the address on the envelope and didn't ask about it. He just put it in his coat pocket and came back 3 days later and told her it was sent. That was enough. On the last Friday of April, when the aspens were just beginning to show their first leaves and the mud on the iron pine track had dried to something manageable, Ronan drove Lenora into town for the spring council meeting, the first one she'd been invited to attend as a formal participant rather than a subject of discussion. The council met in the same building where Commissioner Peel had once run his hearings. Peel himself was gone, resigned in the wake of the investigation, moved somewhere east, nobody had tracked where, and nobody had particularly tried. His replacement was a woman named Agnes Burrow, a rancher's widow who had been operating her late husband's property for 6 years with a competence that the county had spent most of that time pretending not to notice. Agnes ran the meeting with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has been waiting a long time for her turn and intends to use it well. The items on the agenda were practical. The schoolhouse needed a new roof before the following winter. The road commission needed additional funding. There was a proposal to establish a small lending library in the former land management building, Creed's building, which the town had purchased for $1 from the territorial court's restitution fund. Lenora sat at the council table for the first time. She had opinions about the roof funding mechanism and the lending library proposal, and she offered them both clearly and without softening them. And Agnes Burrow listened and made notes and said, after the meeting, that the council was glad Lenora had come back. "I'm glad to be back," Lenora said, and meant it not as a performance, not as the gracious statement the moment seemed to call for. She actually meant it. She had loved Red Hollow before it had turned on her. She had loved the country and the work and the specific daily labor of being useful to a community. Creed had used that community's fear against her, had manipulated its worst instincts into a weapon. But the fear and the instincts weren't the whole of Red Hollow any more than a town's worst day is the whole of what it is. She knew this because she had also seen Pelham's face in the saloon when Ronan had asked him to trust what he knew instead of what he'd been told. She had seen the Strauss boy faithfully feeding a difficult dog through a Wyoming winter. She had seen Clara Hedges standing in a schoolroom doorway, trying to say something true, even when it was uncomfortable. People were not consistent. They were not reliable in the ways you wanted them to be. They failed at the wrong moments and showed up sometimes at the right ones. You worked with what showed up. On the drive back to Iron Pine, the evening light was doing something particular to the western sky, a long, layered quality that this part of Wyoming produced sometimes in spring, the kind that makes the land look briefly like a painting of itself. Ronan was quiet beside her on the wagon bench, which was his natural state and which she had stopped needing to fill. After a while she said, "The council wants me to serve a formal term. Advisory capacity on education and documentation." "Will you?" she said. Obviously, he almost smiled. "Agnesboro is going to be good," Lenora said. "She already is." "Red Hollow could use good," Ronan said. "It could use a lot of things," she said. "Makes it interesting." He glanced at her sideways with the expression she'd come to know as his version of amusement, subtle enough that she'd missed it the first several times and had only started catching it reliably around month 2. She caught it now. They turned onto the Iron Pine track, and the pines closed in on either side, green and solid, the same trees that had been there when Margaret had loved this country, and when Ronan had spent 3 years alone inside the silence of it, and when Lenora had arrived with nothing but what she was wearing, and a decision not to be less than herself. The house came into view. Bracken was on the porch, because Bracken was always on the porch when he heard the wagon coming, preserving his dignity by being already there rather than running to meet them. Lenora looked at the house and the porch and the dog and the east fence and the garden beds that were just beginning to show the first green of the season. She had built this. Not from nothing, Ronan had built the structure of it, the ranch and the bones of the life. But she had built into it, her hands on those fence posts, her system in that ledger, her voice in those rooms. It was hers in the way that things become yours, not through ownership, but through investment, through the work you put in and the years you intend to stay. She intended to stay. Ronan pulled the wagon to a stop, and Bracken came down the porch steps at a dignified trot, which lasted until he got within 10 feet of Lenora and then became a completely undignified scramble that ended with his head on her knee the moment she stepped down. "Every time," Ronan said. "He has feelings," she said. "He has no sense of proportion," Ronan said. "Neither do I," she said. "Fine." She scratched Bracken's ears and looked at Ronan over the dog's head, and he looked back at her in the early evening light with the steady, unperforming quality that had been the first true thing she'd known about him. She had been chained to a post in the summer heat, with a sign around her neck and the judgment of an entire town pressing down on her, and she had kept her eyes on the middle distance and refused to cooperate with any of it. And this was where that refusal had eventually brought her, not as a reward, not as a fairy tale conclusion to suffering, but as the natural result of a person staying true to what they actually were, regardless of what they were being told they were, and finding, in the process, the people in the place that could see them clearly. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. She went up the porch steps and opened the door and went inside, and the house received her the way it always did now, warm, imperfect, hers.